Previously on the Resident Evil podcast.
Even though Wesker's dead and buried, and he's going to stay dead and buried, he's still kind of influencing events from beyond the grave.
It's just like Fraggle Rock meets the Village People. A just ridiculous, fantastical cast of oddities.
That would possibly also explain how he was able to father a child when he's essentially just a bag of mould.
Revived through the mould when I touched it all the years ago with HCS. There's the Red Umbrella core from...
Yeah, but they're secret.
Well, I do apologise, Nick.
The Resident Evil Podcast.
Hello and welcome to episode 97 of the Resident Evil Podcast. More compelling than any Umbrella board meeting, but perhaps less murdery. I'm Nick, better known as Neptune. Let's see who's joining us today. Sorry, but he just won't hand over his life's work. Oh wait, he has. It's on our website. It's the Batman.
Good evening.
T001, T002, T103. Nah, just a cup of tea for him. It's Stars Tyrant.
Good evening.
There's 100,000 of them in Raccoon City, but there's only one Rombi.
Yo.
Coming up in this slightly different podcast, we're casting our eyes back on the original trilogy to look at how that particular trilogy of games influenced movies and games afterwards, but also the products and the media that Resident Evil was influenced itself by. So, looking at older movies, some of the games beforehand, so things like Alone in the Dark, and just trying to gauge an opinion and, our experiences of horror and the survival horror genre, but also to have a good look back as well at the OG trilogy and why it's so beloved and its long-term lasting impact. That's the plan. We've got lots to cover. So let's start with the news. The first bit of major news that's come out is that the Resident Evil 7 director is going to be the director of Resident Evil 9, which is good news, I think. I mean, certainly from our point of view, we're all big fans of Resident Evil 7, that being a slightly soft reboot of the series, and it really brought back the core components of survival horror. So I am slightly optimistic that we may get a slightly more calmer Resident Evil 9 than perhaps Village. I've often said Village was at the very precipice of what I consider to be survival horror versus survival action. So I'm hopeful Resident Evil 9 is a little bit more slowed down for my personal taste, but obviously everyone has their own opinion. What does everyone else think?
Well, Nakanishi has said, hasn't he, that it's took him a while to figure out the best direction to go in after Resident Evil 7, and he's sort of made some cryptic comments that he thinks he's found, the ideal direction to go in. So I'm hoping it's going to be something really substantial, and I think whatever he's got planned will be something completely different yet again, hopefully.
It's also worth saying, I think, as well, that I did see some people online sort of misunderstand his statement of that in terms of like trying to find the follow-up to 7. I don't think he means like the literal canon storyline follow-up to 7. I think he means in terms of its like cultural impact. It's like, how do you rediscover what we did there all over again? It will still follow, hopefully, in some ways, like the events of Village. It will still be Resident Evil 9, I say in inverted commas. I don't think it's going to be a direct sequel to 7 like some people online have tried to spin. That's not really what he was saying. I think he means in terms of it being a project for him. How does he better what he did there? That's how I interpret it.
I'm quite curious how this works too, because the way that obviously things have panned out, 8 wasn't originally intended to be 8. It was just Village, and it was during its development where the ideas started to coalesce to the idea where they went, oh, this could actually be a proper full-blown sequel. That obviously he's been working on this since 7 because it was supposed to be probably the next mainline sequel that he was going to work on anyway. So it's obviously been a long time coming, which makes it very interesting. And I'm sure it's gone through already probably several iterations that we'll never either hear much of or at all to get to this point. So it's had a long gestation period even to get to this point. So it'll be very interesting when it gets revealed, I'm sure.
I hope there's a lot of as I said, 7's DNA in it, but I mean, I personally think I'm often advocating having Mia in it in some capacity, just so that there's a kind of beat between 7, 8, and 9. 4, 5, 6 kind of did it a little bit. I think 6 feels a little bit different because it's a different virus or that kind of thing. But I'm hoping that, you can see it's a trilogy in that sense. And it will kind of bring an end to perhaps the Blue Umbrella Connections storyline.
I would like to think it'll have the connections in there, so you might have some sort of mention of Mia, but I'll be surprised if they use the mould again. I think that mould storyline was wrapped up quite nicely, so I think they might go for something new. I just hope it's as bold and brave as Resident Evil 7 was, being a complete contrast to what Resident Evil 6 was.
Yeah.
I really hope it's going to be something different, and given his comments, he seems quite confident that we are going to experience yet another kind of possible gameplay reboot at least.
Other news comes from the world of Dead Rising. Well, yes, there we go. Not something you thought we'd hear, but Dead Rising Deluxe, which has recently been announced by Capcom, actually has some bonus costumes in it that come from the world of Resident Evil, plus music tracks. Rob, you were just telling me about this before we came onto air, much to our excited tone.
I was a late adopter of Dead Rising. I didn't play the first one. Well, I didn't play the first one at all, basically, barring a little bit of mucking around on my friend's Xbox. So when the HD version came out, I think it was like almost 10 years ago, maybe 8 years ago, it was the first time I actually got to play through it. So I'm quite happy. I really enjoyed it, so I'm quite happy to play through it again. So this deluxe remaster is something I'm looking forward to. But yeah, having Resident Evil themed bonus things, it goes thematically with the game. I mean, if anyone's played them, they know that there's a lot of Capcom crossovers with costumes and dress-ups.
Sandwiches.
Yeah, exactly. So having this sort of stuff in it makes complete sense. So yeah, there are several bonus costumes, and each costume comes with a track, which I think are all remake tracks. Yeah, Chris with the savoury music from Resident Evil HD, Leon with the I think it's the same save room from Resident Evil 2 Remake, Ashley with the save theme from Resident Evil 4 Remake, Alika with Looming Dread from the remake of Resident Evil 2, Nemesis with the Metamorphosis track from the remake of Resident Evil 3, and the Villagers from 4 with a remake track from Resident Evil 4's one. So they're dress-up costumes. There are other bonuses and stuff. It's all pre-order content. I assume that'll become DLC for paid amounts, as they usually do with Capcom stuff later on down the track. I think the game comes out, I can't remember, is it September or October? I forget, but later this year. And it looks like it'll be interesting. I think the reaction to it's going to be mixed, because I think the way that Frank West looks like and his voice is so iconic, and they've redone the voice work and his look and made a skin for pre-order that has his original skin, which is very controversial too, but should be interesting anyway. I'm looking forward to it regardless.
Last bit of news is actually not official Capcom news, but something a few of our listeners have been asking for. So you would have almost certainly, if you follow Resident Evil on social media, would have seen the recently released fan movie from the team over at Biohazard Declassified, their fan film of The Keeper's Diary, which you can check out on YouTube. It's had a lot of fanfare, and I thought it was a good opportunity for us to have a quick chat about it. We've got, obviously, the George Romero documentary coming out very soon, and we're all very excited about that as well. So, we've been treated to a couple of projects, and The Keeper's Diary is certainly one of them, which, without spoiling too much, it basically follows the famous Keeper's Diary from the first Resident Evil game, and that's been adapted into a film of about 10 minutes, 12 minutes long. What did we all think of it?
Oh, I enjoyed it for what it was. I thought it was, very entertaining. It was really nice to see some of the pages of the Keeper's Diary visualised. I enjoyed the poker scene. It looked very much how I've visualised it myself in my own head many times when I've read that file. All smoking cigarettes, playing poker in the guardhouse in the early hours of the morning. I like that imagery, and likewise the scenes in the lab where they're watching the hunter in its secure cell. I enjoyed all that sort of thing. And it was just very atmospheric, and some of the effects were quite impressive as well. For a fan film, I think everyone involved did a very fine job.
Stars?
Yeah, I think they must be commended for the effort for sure. And I really like how they sourced some of the talent from the original game. It was great to see Charlie in there, and obviously it was a nice tribute to Joe White to get him to voice. So it's a labour of love, and I suppose the big marketing sort of pitch was that it was by the fans for the fans, and I think that's apparent throughout the project. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think they achieved what they set out to do. It's very literal in that sense. It is what you would expect, but I agree with what John said there. The atmosphere is very good, and I think it was a sensible decision to kind of base the look off the original mansion as opposed to the remake mansion. It's a little bit brighter in the background. The aesthetic looks more of that guardhouse, and some of the corridors and scenery from the OG mansion. I think that was a good decision, and yeah, the Hunter CGI was particularly impressive. There's a couple of things I wouldn't have necessarily done, but minor nitpicks. I think they should be highly commended for not only securing the funding, but then actually following through and doing a really good adaptation of what could be explored in a live action movie. But yeah, very good. Rob, what did you think? You were our kind of movie man.
I think for the tone that they obviously wanted, they nailed exactly the motif, and as you guys have alluded to, kind of with the sort of styling of the way the visualization already existed. If it was in your head from reading that diary, all those years ago, I think it's the way that everyone interpreted it come to life, and I thought that was really good. I'm much like you, Nick. There's probably a few things I personally would have done differently, but that's not the point. That's the idea that as a fan film, they can do their interpretation of it, and I think from that perspective it succeeds very well, so they should be very much commended for the efforts and for putting that together with the support of all the people that worked on it and all the people that helped fund it, because it's definitely a visual style that I really enjoyed from that perspective, and I think it was really, really cool to see. So yeah, I think it's worth noting that obviously they've got ideas for something else, which doesn't cover our realm, but it is kind of relevant to what we're talking about today. So it's kind of funny as well. So I recommend anyone who hasn't seen it probably go check it out. I'm sure pretty much everyone who's listening to us probably has, because it has been thrown around the community quite a bit. So, but if you haven't, then you definitely could go check it out. Yeah.
That does conclude all our gaming news. We now move over to our site news, where firstly I want to thank a couple of new patrons who have joined us. So a thank you to Dirty Rufus and Rich Gibbs, who recently joined. If anyone's interested in our Patreon, you can head over to our website and click on the community tab, and there's a big link there. That moves on to our main site news discussion, which is huge. Yes. As of yesterday, at the point of recording, Batman has released the updated version of his incredible mythology. We're very excited about this. This is the remake version of the mythology, so in the sense that it's all brand new, up to date, all the way up to Village, but incorporates the new lore from Resident Evil 2, 3 and 4 remake. It's available on the website, and we've added a new drop-down menu under the features tab under timeline, and you click on either the old timeline called the Prime Timeline, which is the old version that was out when the website launched in 2019, and now this remake one. Click on that, and then you've got all the incredible work by John. John, did you want to talk a little bit more about it, what you've done, what's in it, what's not in it, and why we've gone this kind of remake route?
Yeah, so first and foremost, I just wanted it to be fully updated to where the series is now. So it's obviously got Village and Infinite Darkness and Shadows of Rose, Death Island in there. And adding the remakes is something I've wrestled with internally for a long time now, because even though us as a group probably still prefer the original games and the lore connected to those particular titles, it's no secret a large portion of the fan base prefers the remakes, and some have never really even played the originals because they're so old now. So it was always the question of how best to integrate all the new elements the remakes had introduced. And as more time went by, and especially with the release of Resident Evil 4, where the remake changed, some story elements quite dramatically, such as Leon and Krauser's relationship, and Krauser no longer working with Wesker, it just seemed the most sensible way to approach it was to present two versions. So that way I could include every single piece of story information, and it would respect the visions of the original writers of all the games without sort of mixing those visions up by sandwiching the new lore on top of the old and trying to force a square peg into a round hole, when it just was never going to work that way. So this remake version uses the remakes as a focus. It does include a lot of lore from the original games, because the remakes don't really have any supplemental materials of their own. So anything that doesn't contradict has been carried over, but anything that does contradict has obviously been left out. I've substantially reduced it. It's now less than half the size of the original, because I'm well aware the original version was far too big and quite off-putting for a lot of people. And I'm aware this kind of document is a bit outdated and archaic in this sort of day and age where everyone just wants a 5-minute YouTube video explaining everything. But because this relies on, things like translations and presenting every single element of what happens in the games, there was really no other way to do it. So, I really hope people will take the time to at least read some of it. I have redone every single translation and the version containing the original trilogy of games, and Resident Evil 4 will come out later down the line, possibly towards Christmas time. It won't be a complete rewrite. Most of it will be copy and pasted. It just won't contain any remake lore. And the point of it is just simply to present all the information. It's not trying to promote one version as more canon over the other. It's not trying to suggest that there's 2 timelines now and everything's separate. That's all that kind of stuff is up to the individual person to decide. All I want to do is simply present all the information. Because it's not just the game's events that are different. There's some quirky differences to various story elements. One small example is like the Hunter program. The Hunter Gammas originally found in Raccoon Park in Resident Evil 3, they were created after the mansion incident, based on combat data collected against the stars in the mansion. And the remakes changed that by saying, no, the Hunter Gammas existed prior to the mansion incident and, was sold to, well, not sold, but sent to Umbrella Europe for further development. Whereas in the original trilogy, the Gammas were always an Umbrella Europe thing. So it's just little differences like that I think are interesting. So it'd be nice once both versions are out there that people can look at them and if they're interested, compare and contrast all these little details and see exactly what all the changes are.
Yeah, and just to re-emphasise, you're not saying that one's more canon over the other. It's just that if for the unique position that you are in preparing a timeline like this, it makes it a little bit muddled. If you were to say combat data from the Hunter Gamma now from Hunter 121 now begins work on the Gamma, but then you say earlier in the same document the Gamma is completed. So it's slightly contradictory, but at the same time, you can kind of pick and choose which one you want. So for the purposes of presenting a mythology and or a coherent timeline, it's just there, and we're not advocating any. People say, "Oh, I consider it's." For me, I would take Remake 4 over OG 4, but there'll be people quite rightly who would say, oh, no, not at all. 100%, that's just what it is. And I think this is the way the series is kind of going, and it's a bit picky and choosy, whatever you feel that you think's canon. But as I said, for the unique position that Batman John's in, it was felt present everything in a non-contradictory manner. We're just going to present it in 2 documents, and as John says, the updated version of what we're now calling the Prime timeline is coming towards the end of the year. So that'd be version 5 of the original mythology, if you want to call it that.
Yeah, the only controversial thing in the remake timeline, if you like, is the events of Outbreak have been removed because they simply don't fit with the remake interpretation of the Raccoon City storyline. But I've explained all that kind of thing in the notes. But the Outbreak games will be reinstated for the Prime timeline for sure.
It's an incredible document. Please check it out. Just over on our website. It's the main piece of news at the moment. But if you just hover on the features tab, you can't miss it. And please go have a read. Our final bit of news, very quickly, is that we've recently recorded our audio commentary for Resident Evil Afterlife. So that was up, I think, last week at the point of recording. We sat through and enjoyed the 4th entry. It's more of a reminder. If you're going to play along with us, then you just need to download it and then kind of play it as you're watching and see how you get on. Batman, you decided sensibly to miss this one, but we're going to drag you back, kicking and screaming. For Retribution.
Can't wait.
Oh, wait, but there we go. Please check that out as well if you have nothing to do in an evening. You think, you know what? I want to watch Mila Jovovich and Adi Lata run around. Go for it.
Your favourite highlight was Crystal Waters.
Crystal Waters, yes. Lovely. That does bring our site news, and all the news for that matter, to an end. We now turn our attentions to the main focus of the podcast, Resident Evil, the OG trilogy, and its influences. as mentioned in the beginning of the podcast, we are looking at the original trilogy, specifically what made them special, but then what in Capcom were making the games, what games, what movies, what influenced them in creating what I would consider a masterpiece of a trilogy, and subsequently the success of the original trilogy, what then was influenced by that trilogy of games, and lastly then kind of looking at Resident Evil itself, why has it been so successful and what other games have been adapted from it. We've always spoken about success of Resident Evil being down the fact that we've had so many kind of soft reboot. The games have been reimagined a number of times, both the originals and then over the shoulder, first person done particularly well, then of course the recent remakes as well. They've all been hallmarks in their own sort of way. So there's potential if this podcast is successful and people enjoy what we've been talking about, there's more that we could bring to the table in terms of future influences, but for this purpose we're going to be looking at the original trilogy and how great they are, and generally speaking about what influenced the original team at Capcom when making these. So largely we're talking about horror gaming, aren't we, and the advent of using the media of video games to promote horror stories. So what games have everyone played prior? Any horror games people have played before Resident Evil came along? Was there any early games? I mean, we're going back though, aren't we? And there's not many, pre-1995. I think the scariest game I ever played was Killer Instinct on the SNES. That was gory.
For me, it would be on the Mega Drive. It'd be something like Decapitac or something, which had obviously like a horror spin to it, but no sort of dedicated out-and-out horror game. I never even got like a Mega CD to have like the FMV horror games, like
yes.
Night Trap and things like that. I wasn't able to play any of them.
Yeah, the horror gaming landscape was very hit and miss. I mean, I remember playing like cheesy kind of like zombie-esque games and horror games and stuff on like those side scrollers. I remember there was a lot of story type games where you those pick a path games. One of the ones I remember, the first thing I ever played was a game called Transylvania, and it was literally like one of those things where you have like a graphic and it's like in front of you there is a stump, you can see blah blah, what do you want to do, and there are paths leading west and north. Like it was based around obviously vampires and monsters and stuff like that. It's just such a weird kind of subgenre that I don't really think a lot of people really ever kind of thought of like as a type of game.
For me, I had Zombies Ate My Neighbours on the Mega Drive, although that was more of a comedy, but what a fantastic game that was. But one of my earliest horror games was Splatterhouse 2.
Oh, Splatterhouse, yeah, of course.
I mean, it wasn't necessarily, well, I suppose it did have zombies in it, but it had the mansion setting and it had such a fantastic soundtrack. I really recommend you listen to the soundtrack on YouTube. But yeah, Splatterhouse 2 was one of my early horror games. I remember that well.
Do you count Wolfenstein?
Yeah, I'd class Wolfenstein in there. It's like,
actually Doom
creatures and the original Doom. They always tend to be cross-genre. It's like the shooter, but it's got horror elements, but it's more about the action. Or it's like John was talking about, where it's like, it's a kind of a campy, side-scrolling kind of thing. I don't think there was a heck of a lot of like out-and-out like horror-esque games. I mean, people made them. There's like a lot of haunted houses and mansions and all that sort of stuff. That's kind of a motif that I think runs through a lot of these, haunted environments, people being isolated, and they're all kind of tropes that come from movies,
If I go way back to when I had, and people aren't even going to understand what I'm about to say here, but an Amstrad 464, which used cassette tapes to actually play the game. I do remember a first-person 3D game on the Amstrad. It ran at about 0.5 frames a second. But it was Castle Master, and that was a game where you were in an isolated castle. You were on your own. You had to find like keys to unlock extra sections of the castle, and there were ghosts you'd have to shoot with your little crossbow thing, and you had to sort of find your way out. And like, I suppose when I actually do think back, as I've just sat here now, that's probably one of the earliest experiences I ever had, and we're talking about like when I was probably not even 10 yet, of playing a game where you had a very sort of Resident Evil style setup in that you had a singular location with locked doors and you had to, wander around. And like I say, it was in first person, very archaic, non-textured polygons, but it was enough to give you a sense of space even then.
Funnily enough, that Amstrad you're talking about there, that was my introduction to the Alien franchise.
All right. Oh, wow.
This was before I'd seen the films, obviously. My friend had Aliens on there, and it must be one of the earliest examples of a first-person shooter. And There was basically, I think there was 6 characters. There was Gorman, Burke, Hicks, Ripley, Vasquez, and Bishop. And it was through their perspective of the suit cameras. And you had to change, you could press a key to change to a different person's camera. And if one of the other Marines was in trouble, the motion tracker would beep. And it was scary as. You know, it sounds very, very, very primitive, but look for it on YouTube. When that motion tracker sounded and you weren't on the right camera, it was terrifying.
This is where I was going to go, and John's gone to a natural point here, which is that a lot of the horror-esque games I played were a lot of like movie tie-ins, and they were based on those sorts of action-y horror or like horror titles, and Alien was definitely one of those ones that I played several games that they made, be it side-scrollers or be it PC titles.
Wasn't
I mean, even
Halloween. I think there's some Halloween titles. Or Jason.
Jason's from Friday the 13th ones. Yeah, definitely some of those. Although they err, I mean, I know them now. They err on the side of comedy. They're like kind of like there's all these wacky enemy types, and you're playing as Jason, and it has nothing to do with like killing teenagers. It's all to do with like bats flying around and weird things coming out. It doesn't make any sense. But of course, most of these licensed games back in those days, they just were licenses, and they could just get away with doing whatever it is to make a game. I mean, that's it. I mean, it's much like we're both talking about real old formats. Even that Transylvania game I talked about, that was on like an Apple IIe with a green monitor. You know, I was 5 or 6, I think, when I remember playing that. So it's such a weird thing that the games were so... Like, I want to say they're in their infancy, but they weren't. I mean, they've been around for a while, but like just that technology changed so rapidly. And they usually had these kind of cross-pollination of genres. So, you know, because of the technology or because of the limitations or because of the sort of games that were popular at the time.
Is it worth a quick mention on Castlevania as a kind of relatively long-standing game?
I think so, because it works in this idea of like a lot of the horror tropes, and you know, especially vampires and werewolves and monsters would be in these games, and that's the thing to me. A lot of these games just use those existing tropes or existing characters and would put them into a gameplay element because that was the trend at the time. There are books and there's deep dive there's a documentary that's under process right now. I think you guys are aware of, that's to do with like the history of kind of like horror. There's books about horror gaming and so forth, and everyone has these different answers as to like the early stuff, and the fact that it didn't really start to coalesce until the 90s is probably part of that sign, when there's a sort of level of maturity that started to come through in the kind of 16-bit era, I guess.
You're a big fan, Sean, of Castlevania.
Yeah. I mean, Castlevania is one of my favourite game series of all time, but I don't know whether I would essentially connect it in any way to, you know, yes, it has got like zombies and classical monsters in it.
Ghosts and ghouls.
Maybe one day we will get Jill with a ball and chain whip slashing, you know.
Well, isn't there...
I'm sure Mila's done it in one of the movies at some point, used some sort of whip. In fact, she uses a chain, doesn't she, against the bioweapon in the final chapter.
Oh, spoilers, I haven't watched. I was going to say, isn't there in Revelations 2 a kind of a weird game like Ghosts and Ghouls with Jill in it, or am I making that
on the
up?
Switch version, there is a Ghouls and Ghosts mini game that you can play, where you play as Barry, I think, and you have to go through a couple of levels. But yeah, I mean, obviously, Ghouls and Ghosts is a Capcom franchise.
I was talking about Splatterhouse earlier, and from memory, that's one of the earliest horror games where I think it actually came with a warning beforehand.
Oh, really?
This was pre-Mortal Kombat, and you got warnings about the graphic, because the graphics were good for the time, and the imagery. I think there's a scene in there where you basically kill zombie babies with a chainsaw. And it was really, really controversial at the time. I think it was 1992 when it came out.
It's so controversial that I remember then I don't know if you remember this, but they made a new version of it about 10 years ago. It was like a Xbox 360 PS3 era title, and they put in a bunch of the classic games as unlockables, and I think they changed, like it was slightly censored some of the classic games, which is so weird when the new game is like this ultra violent kind of over the top. It's like, I don't know what it was rated overseas, but I'm sure it was like an R16 or an R18 here in New Zealand. It was ridiculous, and yet the classic ones were censored.
Wow. I'm having a look now. You can get it on the TurboGrafx 16.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
It was pretty controversial. I remember like magazines used to cover it. Like one of the bosses, its main attack was like it vomited at you and things like that, and it was seen as like quite poor taste by the media that covered it. You know, with like the chainsawing of zombie babies and things. And its inspirations were clearly, you know, like Jason from the Friday the 13th movies, and
Yes.
which of course was, a 80s fan favourite amongst teenagers, and it was infecting the video games.
It was. Well, with that in mind, then that kind of moves on. I mean, when Resident Evil came out, I think it's always nice to reminisce on how everyone kind of not got into it, but what appealed from the outset. I mean, we've probably spoken about it before, but I think it's always worth reminding folks about our personal stories into Resident Evil, perhaps in light of some of the games you played before. So, John, let's start with you. I know after playing things like maybe Splatterhouse, why were you drawn into this? Was it the mystery, the horror?
It was just this perspective. My first experience, even though I didn't get the game myself till 1997, it was the year earlier when it came out, and one of my friends had it, and I didn't really have any interest when he told me what it was, but watching it, just that third-person camera, the static camera angles, I should say. I'd never seen anything like that before. I'd never really seen much of Alone in the Dark and the sort of progenitors of it. So just watching him play that perspective where he'd be going down a corridor and you'd see Jill's back, and the next minute you'd go through a door and a face would be right there looking at you. And you couldn't see where the zombies were. And obviously, because the graphics were pre-rendered rather than 3D, the graphics looked so much better than anything else that was around at the time. So that was definitely the intriguing element for me, because it made the horror aspects, so much more real. You could just see the atmosphere. That was certainly the key reason why I wanted to get it and play it myself.
Romby, what about you?
I mean, mine was from a movie perspective. I had recently just seen, within the last couple of years before that, I had seen a few zombie movies. I'd never seen any zombie movies before that. So I think I saw Ramirez Dawn of the Dead, I saw Peter Jackson's Brain Dead, and a couple of low-budget schlocky things. I saw Return of the Living Dead, the comedy one where the zombies talk. And so I was starting to get into this idea of horror movies, and I have friends that were watching lots of slasher movies and all that sort of stuff. So I think it was just that right thing at the right time. I mean, I've told the story before how it wasn't perhaps the gameplay perspective or anything like it was for John, but my first experience of that, I think I've told the story before, was watching a guy in a shop playing it, talking very loudly about how amazing it looked, which admittedly it was, but it looked really slow and dull, and I didn't see any enemies, so I thought it was just kind of this weird, boring, exploring puzzle game or something like that. And it wasn't until my friends had rented it out a few days later and told me about this amazing horror game that was just so cool and you have to see it. And we went into the house and they had it out again because they loved it so much. They went and rented it out again, and then my friend's brother went and bought it straight away after that. But yeah, just seeing that perspective and seeing the zombies, it's it's a zombie game. Oh, this is like a haunted mansion kind of thing. Oh, this is really cool. This is my wheelhouse right now. I'm really into this sort of stuff. It just caught my imagination and my attention like nothing else at that time. It just was the right thing at the right time.
So from my point of view, I was a bit late to the party as well. 1998, I think I've said before, my friend was saving up for Resident Evil 2 and he was selling one, and he asked, did I want to buy it off? And I remember going, what type of game is it? And he goes, horror game. And I said, first or third person? And he went, second, or something like that. It was like, and he was like, well, he kind of ummed and ahed about it. He goes, it's kind of third person? And I was like, And I must have looked at a few magazines at the time and then had a look. I said, all right, okay. I was a bit... 15 quid I thought was pretty good anyway. It was still a good £40, maybe £30 in the shop. So I thought, all right, okay. And by this point, I think I'd already played Grand Theft Auto on the PC. I had either a pirated copy or something like that, I think. I'm pretty sure I had House of Dead as well on my PC, pirated. So I was kind of getting into the kind of more mature games, having grown up very much on kind of Mario and Donkey Kong, things like that. And with the advent of PlayStation and things were getting a little bit more serious, and I had Tekken, Gran Turismo, proper games as you felt when you were that age, not that Mario shit, that kind of thing. And then this came along, and I remember just loading it up and instantly feeling from the very moment with the eye and then the introduction with Chris screaming and then the kind of fake blood, and I was like, oh my god. And I'm not very good at horror movies generally. I still don't watch that many. And watching the opening video and kind of going, okay, this is fine, this looks funny, and then you get the kind of B-roll, but that just added to the kind of, there's something wrong with this. And then there's being blown away really by the graphics. I thought they were incredible. But then the music, for me, it was all about the music. It's just no music at the beginning, just the ticking clock, and you're like, okay. And then as you start to explore, you just get banger after banger of uneasy music in this house. And it's stuck with me ever since. Every corridor, a new corridor you're going in, and there's suddenly that orchestral tone of, oh, you have no idea what's coming. And it was this feeling, and I still have it, I had it with Resident Evil 7, of I didn't really want to play on, but you want to, but you don't really. That kind of thing. And it's why I always kind of pick the original over even the remake, because of that amazing atmosphere. And that was what really intrigued me. And then as you play on more, the gameplay was good. Then the mystery element was particularly interesting. Reading all the files, it was like nothing I'd ever played before. I was grabbed by the hook with this game. That was kind of my feeling and tropes into it. What about you, Sean?
I think for me, I mean, obviously I was a latecomer as well because I didn't actually have a PlayStation at the time. But what I'd found was in the 90s was that I was very attracted to like quite violent games. Not for any twisted reason, I just was fascinated by them. So I was a big Mortal Kombat fan and really enjoyed Mortal Kombat on the Mega Drive. Of course, the Mega Drive version of the original game was one of the only ones that actually had a code to unlock like the full gore and everything like that. And my cousin had got a PlayStation and he got Doom as soon as it came out. And me and him played Doom quite a lot. And I was quite, like I say, attracted to these quite violent video games. And people probably won't believe this if you weren't aware of the context, although coincidentally the current GOG version of the original might actually remind people thanks to the fully uncensored FMV sequence opening. But like Resident Evil was for a time classed as a bit of a video game nasty because it's very controversial live action footage, which was extremely violent for the era it was made in. And it made a lot of magazines because back then, you didn't have Wikipedia pages or anything like that. The only source of information was when you used to get magazines. And I'll never forget there was an issue, and I think I've still got it upstairs in the loft of computer and video games. Was it CVG? Possibly was, where they were covering video game nasties. Like, so it was talking about like the Mega CD Night Trap games and, the ones that were very controversial for their adult content. And one of the things they covered, and I think this was after it had come out for the PlayStation, but they were one of the first magazines in the UK to actually show like full colour images of the uncensored intro. And it was fascinating to see, because I was really keen on censorship at the time as well, because I was allowed to watch a lot of very adult movies when I was younger. So I was allowed to watch, just not anything extraordinary, but things like RoboCop and things that I was allowed to watch as a very young teenager. So then when they used to be like come on our like ITV or BBC One, I would watch them and then be fascinated by what's been censored. And I think that's how my sort of journey with Resident Evil began. It was a fascination of the fact that there was like this video game nasty that has been subject to censorship. And I remember, and anyone who was around at the era will remember, the first time it was shown on like a PSN demo disc was an FMV sequence. And when it was one of the more questionable moments from the FMV intro, it came with a massive censored over the image.
Yep, I remember this.
You could just about make out like bits of blood spraying out and stuff like that.
The Virgin Interactive censored demo reel. Yeah, I know.
Yeah, it was wicked. And I was starting to be fascinated by it. And of course, I didn't have a PlayStation at the time. And then gradually, like all my friends that did have PlayStations had started picking it up and playing it. And they all were saying how fucking amazing it was. And you'd never, people talk about FOMO now, but like I can't describe what it was like back in the 90s to be like. And I loved my Saturn. I dearly loved my Saturn, but it was the first time I ever felt like I never had this in the SNES era, like the Mega Drive, because I had a Mega Drive and I didn't have a SNES, but there was never a game on the SNES which made me like pine for it. But when people started playing Resident Evil on the PlayStation 1, I was beside myself, not able to play it. And then I remember it came to Christmas 1997, and my mum was like, right, you've got all these other various gifts, you can choose one game. And my heart was pulled in two directions. And I've said this before, one path before me was Tomb Raider, because that was, other people had been playing Tomb Raider and said how amazing that was. And on the other hand was Resident Evil. And it was only through word of mouth of my very closest friends that I decided to choose Resident Evil. And then that obviously set me on the path that I've been on ever since. And I never looked back. And the funny thing is, I've dabbled with Tomb Raider on and off over the years, but it's never pulled me in a way that original game did. Because I've talked about this before, but you will never ever match, ever in a million years, that first time, before it became a franchise, before you knew what the future was going to be, nothing matched standing in that main hall and having no idea where each door went, what the mystery was, what the fuck is this haunted house? Because that's, you didn't even really, I obviously knew it had zombies in it because I'd seen the magazine spreads and read the reviews and stuff. But just that sense of isolation, I'd never played anything like it in a video game before. At least in Doom, when you started playing those levels, you obviously had a big fucking shotgun and and speed on your side, you could circle strafe enemies and blow them to bits. But in Resident Evil, you felt vulnerable, and I'd never ever felt like that in a video game before. Like that sense of just danger and isolation, incredible.
And that was on the you got that on the Saturn.
Yeah, I got it on the Saturn, because I didn't have a Mega Drive. Sorry, I didn't have a PlayStation for another couple of years yet. I had to wait for Resident Evil 2 as well until I eventually got a PlayStation 1.
I think a big draw for me, you touched on this, Nick, was the story, because up until then, horror-based games were very thin on the ground in terms of having a substantial narrative. You might get these side-scrolling platformers, the characters might have the odd speech bubble, but that was it. But, something like The Files was just an amazing way to enhance the storyline. And NPC characters who survived the intro sequence, you actually really wanted to find out where the missing members of Bravo team were. You wanted that sort of Doom, Wolfenstein experience, but you wanted a story to go with it. I remember buying Alien Trilogy thinking it's not just going to be me, it's going to be the Marines as well, but all the Marines get killed in the intro. And then it just becomes a Doom clone. Resident Evil must be one of the earlier examples of a horror game with a full-blown storyline behind it.
Sean, I'm going to have to ask, though, did you then go to your friends, well, I've got the Saturn version, I've got extra stuff. Ha ha ha.
The Sega Saturn magazine covered that quite extensively, and you did feel smug, but then, of course, around that same time, when they were gearing up towards Resident Evil 2, obviously, then the director's cut came out on the PlayStation, so it was kind of 6 of one, half dozen of another.
Right.
Well, we both had, neat features, but neither one of us had all of it. So
we still don't.
No. But let's be honest. The battle mode offers, expert amounts of replayability, and any version with the ticks is infinitely superior.
Absolutely.
At the time, before you were bothered about tyrant numbers and stuff like that, it was awesome that Chris got to fight 2 tyrants. Completely nonsense now, but at the time it was ace, because you could almost write off that first one as a T001.
Yep.
I love thinking in an alternate timeline. Sean's on a Tomb Raider podcast right now.
That's the thing, yeah. Like I say, I've dabbled with it, but it's never drawn. I've sometimes sat and pondered which way, it would I have discovered Resident Evil if I'd gone the other way.
It feels like you probably would have still. Maybe.
But we're all such a ripe age, weren't we, when these games hit? That kind of just as the games industry was really exploding with the advent of PlayStation and things like that, and these kind of story-based games were coming in, and it's a privilege really to have been there at the time.
Oh, it is. Yeah, I'd never trade those memories for anything. It's not to sound gatekeepery.
No.
I've said this on a previous podcast not so long ago, actually, but I really wish people could experience what that used to be like before Resident Evil became a franchise, before it became a 24 game series, when it was just that single game. And you had, you remember reading those files wondering, where's it going to lead after this? I genuinely don't know which, there was a time when Resident Evil as a franchise was one game, and you had no idea what Resident Evil 2 was going to be. Surely Chris and Jill were going to be back. Surely. And they weren't.
No, but it is the lack of the internet really was a big deal, because you just didn't have the information. I remember picking up, I did this going a few years later. I suppose the internet was probably around, but not in the way it was. I remember just picking up a magazine and I was like, Resident Evil Survivor? Is this Resident Evil 4? You didn't know, really. You didn't, you might have heard rumblings of something. And I was looking through this magazine going, what is this? And it's like, this looks like the best thing in the world. It's first person, but it looks like it's a normal Resident Evil game. And look, I love the artwork, and I can't wait. And there's an ounce of disappointment when it came out. But, it's hard to experience that kind of surprise nowadays, and I think that's what I kind of miss a little bit.
Out of interest, guys, at the time, one of my closest friends, who remains to this day one of my closest friends in the real world, was actually quite a dedicated PC gamer at that time. And so he'd already played all the Alone in the Dark games in the run-up to when Resident Evil had come out. And I remember he really loved Resident Evil and still loves it to this day. But I remember him not being quite as overwhelmed as some of us were, because he'd kind of experienced a very similar experience, if you like, in the Alone in the Dark games. Had any of you guys played Alone in the Dark before?
I had played the first one.
Yeah, and so would you say that Resident Evil had slightly more muted impact for you because of that? Because you'd already played something of that genre?
I think so in some respects. It's kind of like what I said, because when I saw it, I had just assumed it was a third-person kind of adventure puzzle title, because Alone in the Dark, it's obviously got horror elements, but it's also kind of a murder mystery, or it's like a mystery kind of game more than anything else as well. And so I think my assumption of what Resident Evil was kind of in that line. And so the thing that made up for it for me was then, as I said, when I saw the game and I saw like the live action intro, and I was like, oh, this is like cinematic. This is like a horror movie, and the zombie element and all that sort of stuff. It was that cinematic and storytelling element that John also alluded to that grasped me. I didn't have the impact perhaps from the gameplay design, but I had it from everything else. So what I lacked, it made up for in other areas compared to other games I had played or experienced at that point. Yeah, it's kind of weird. And there are other, I can't remember exactly at the time, but around the time there were other genres other than horror that did use third person. I remember there was a video game of City of Lost Children that came out, I think, the year after Resident Evil. It's a Psygnosis game, and it uses pre-rendered backgrounds as well. And it's like a different type of game to that third person background kind of style, and that had probably been in development for a few years as well. So it wasn't like other developers weren't aware of the idea of that sort of camera angle and that sort of polygon character on top of a 3D rendered background. There were definitely games of that around. It's just nothing had the impact of Resident Evil, and I think it's a sum of all of its parts. It's that the dread, the atmosphere, the gameplay, the horror elements, the narrative, the files, the voice acting, the live action intro, all those elements all coalesced into what grabbed people's attention like nothing else. And I hear bits of it from everyone here. What were their personal bits that each of us kind of grabbed us? We're all kind of different, inherently all the same game, but like for Nick, it's the music and the atmosphere. For John, it was like some of the story writing, or it was the camera angles. For you, it's like the gore and the horror elements, Sean. So it's like, it's very interesting to hear all these perspectives because they're all right. They all make sense. None of these are like terrible reasons to enjoy the franchise. They're all reasons why we would gravitate or be grabbed by it.
Yeah, I distinctly remember even when like first Resident Evil game was kind of out, or perhaps we're up to Resident Evil 2, and there's lots of like mini reviews, and the term survival horror had been very much coined at that point. And I remember a lot of reviews always referring back to Alone in the Dark and crediting Alone in the Dark as being the first survival horror game. And of course, that instantly made me think, oh, let's have a look. But I'll be honest, I've never played the game, but I've seen the pictures, and I just remember it looks somewhat cell-shaded, at least from the images I can see. And I remember I've only ever looked at screenshots and thought, I didn't like the cell shading, I remember. But I don't know, but that's me.
I don't know how to describe it. It's not exactly cell shaded, but it's like the level of detail on your polygon characters was not high level. So they have these like flat plane textures. It's not exactly a cell shade per se, but it's, it was a rudimentary 3D at the time. It was 1992 when it came out. So it is the first 3D kind of survival game of its type. So it's just a rudimentary. It's like if they tried to make Resident Evil that time, it probably would have looked the same. The characters would have been much more. You've got to think the 3D element. I mean, Virtua Fighter around the same era. They have color and flat shades, so they're not cell shaded per se, but they're in that same genre. And it was such an interesting concept at the time. I don't know why I played it. I definitely didn't own it. I think my friend had it must have been the PC version, because I don't think I know anyone who had the 3DO. Although I did see it running on the 3DO. There was a computer shop in my hometown. For some weird reason, the guy must have been invested into like new technologies, and he bought like all the really new consoles. And I remember in the window he had the 3DO and like the Jaguar and like a bunch of like those consoles that all came out, and they sat in those windows for like years. They were still there for like 3 or 4 years after like the PlayStation Saturn were out as well. But he used to put different games on them, and so I definitely remember seeing Need for Speed and Alone in the Dark on that, and the Alien vs Predator Jaguar version, like different things like that. So I definitely remember seeing it there as well. But I know I played it briefly on someone's PC. Probably my friend up the street. I had a friend up the street whose dad, he ran the tech side of our telecommunications thing. He was doing an infrastructure thing, and they had everything. They always had new games all the time and new toys and stuff like that. So I'm pretty convinced it would have been there. I can't remember exactly.
Do you know who else played Alone in the Dark? Shinji Mikami, who was obviously cited that if it were not for Alone in the Dark, then Resident Evil would probably have been a first-person shooter.
Yeah, I mean, I was about to ask generally, do you think the term survival horror being coined and Alone in the Dark getting credited, do you think it's justified?
Well, that's a loaded statement. I mean, Biohazard Resident Evil coined the survival horror
Yeah.
term, but the concept is still in a couple of other games. Alone in the Dark's one of them. Dr. Hauser, which is a Japanese-only game, which also has an atrocious low frame rate. But that also is in the same style as Alone in the Dark, and those both kind of have impacts on that design. The same year that Resident Evil came out, there was a game that did do a first-person horror element, and it proved why this game would never have been successful had it been that, because it's clunky and slow, the frame rate's atrocious. It's a game called Overblood, and that came out in late 1996, and it's a first-person horror. It's the first 3D adventure it's titled as a 3D adventure game on the box art, but it's a horror-based title. And it also didn't particularly do greatly, but it's that same idea. It would have been what Resident Evil was going to be, as Sean alluded to, like the idea of it being a first person.
We can't talk about Resident Evil without talking about Sweet Home, which of course is very much a progenitor of Resident Evil. And if you have the chance of ever kind of playing it or looking up, I think there's quite a lot of information on it on, I think, Crimson Head website as well. You can see the hallmarks of Resident Evil very much in that, especially the kind of George Trevor origins, if you like, and trying to escape a particularly haunted house, which looks very, very similar to the Spencer Mansion.
I mean, a lot of the cinematic elements. I mean, Sweet Home as a game was based on a movie, and so that alone already adds like this kind of cinematic level. It's an RPG and a horror, but there's notes and stuff left, so that kind of inspires the note and cinematic kind of elements of Resident Evil. There's multiple characters. Yeah, the conceit with that game is that if one character dies, you can continue on without them, like until you run out of characters. As if that's
Right.
you're like part of a horror movie with like multiple people, and if they get killed off, the story doesn't end just because of that. It just continues on until there's nobody left. So it's everything the precursor, and of course the producer of Resident Evil, Biohazard, was the director of that game, and his idea was that this 3D game that became Resident Evil was going to be like an updated version of the mechanics of Sweet Home. But they all come back to those same core elements of horror movies and horror genre and zombie movies and monster movies and all that sort of stuff that kind of inspired that level. I mean, zombie movies as well, like, were kind of out of fashion at the time when Resident Evil came out. That's another thing that I think, kind of alluding back to what Sean was saying earlier about being there at the time, you don't quite realize in this age of, like, now you can think of a million different zombie themed things all the time. Even now we're still getting Walking Dead spin-offs. We've had decades of this, but the mid-90s, zombies had disappeared. There wasn't really many zombie movies. They were mostly comical when they weren't taken seriously as like an enemy type. So, very different, very risky maneuver even to choose them as the main enemy type in this game, really, when you think about it too.
Another series that was out pre-Resident Evil was the Clock Tower, specifically the first two games, which came out in 1995 and 1996. These were quite controversial games, and they're highly sought after now. They're quite collectible and did things a little bit different. But again, I'm afraid it's not a game I've ever played, but its influence and legacy certainly lives on.
Well, the thing about Clock Tower was it was the idea of surviving a serial killer or slasher kind of movie, I guess, in some respects. But there was more elements of like your 70s, like Psycho, not the movie Psycho, but like your Psycho killer kind of concepts in a like a Dario Argento kind of concept, that sort of surviving that sort of horror elements. The original's getting a remake, as everyone may know, that's coming out. And
Yes.
The sequel came out on the PS1, was also kind of like 3D, which was quite unusual for its time too, and it came out the same year as Resident Evil did. And they're very different games, and it's interesting to think in a world where maybe Resident Evil didn't exist, maybe Clock Tower would have been a bigger success because of the style of its game may have influenced others had Resident Evil not come along, because we still have games that are survival games in that same sense. I mean, I think of something like Alien Isolation, and it's Clock Tower in a different guise.
Yeah, I agree with that, yeah.
You are hiding, you are using defensive weapons to get away rather than being able to kill something. And those sorts of horror games eventually did come around. And I feel in a different timeline, if Resident Evil didn't exist, if Biohazard didn't exist, Clock Tower might have been Biohazard, interestingly enough. So.
All right. Well, I think the only other game we can think of is Deception, which was in 1996.
Deception was like an interesting concept because it came from the idea that you played as a bad guy. and you took down people that were trying to. It's almost like you were, for the back of a bit of terms, because it's not exactly what the game is, but it's kind of the idea if you were Dracula and you had people invading your castle trying to kill you.
Right.
And so it's a horror title in the reverse sense, and it's a very interesting title for its time. Yeah. There was also D, which was, is an FMV thing, which I think also, and I think this is what I wanted to mention as well about the FMVs of Resident Evil, is that we were in the FMV era. That CD crossover period of the mid-90s where everyone did filming of live action events, and we did a lot of FMV sequences and stuff. The fact that Resident Evil had a live action intro and stuff, aside from the fact it was cheaper to shoot that than it was to create one in 3D, render it realistically, that was just what everyone did. It was cheaper to go out and film something at that point, or make short videos because you had the format and CD. So that whole thing of moving into a cinema level of kind of events was all driven by technology as well. Like, we can do stuff with music and we can do stuff with video. And again, these are all elements that really every single horror game onwards would kind of really jump on board, is that we can start to build atmosphere around these things.
You just reminded me, Rob, talking about D, there was also on the Saturn and PC Enemy Zero.
Yeah,
which was a big one. That was 96.
Oh god, I forgot about Enemy Zero.
Yeah, which was like quite a scary game because it involved you being isolated on a space station with an invisible enemy. So you used to go down like super long dark corridors where you couldn't see what was hunting you. But it was quite notable because like the FMVs were quite graphic and violent and very cinematically done. For people who are, listen, we obviously prep these things in advance, and Robert Good produced a massive list. And I'm quite frustrated that only now, after like weeks of planning this and talking about it, I've only remembered Enemy Zero now. As we're recording it.
It's funny too because I had that on one of my early lists, and I've removed it because it's the Kenji Eno bloody thing, isn't it?
Yeah, Kenji Eno, yeah.
Far out, because that was his follow up to D, and of course, wow, yeah, it was a crazy kind of like weird interactive. Like, it's hard to explain to people now what these games are like because you kind of take it for granted that you have like this. I mean, there was other games, and I'm not even putting this in the horror camp, but think about like you going around doing stuff in first person, like Myst. If you played Myst,
I did play Myst,
and Riven and stuff like that. Yeah.
Riven and stuff. It was a thing to kind of explore things in a first person thing, but with these video sequences or like moving animation stills or whatever. I mean, in theory, something like Myst is also like Resident Evil because you had 3D elements over the top of like pre-rendered backgrounds. Again, kind of going back to what I was saying earlier about this kind of that of the genre, and D was definitely that sort of thing too, and Enemy Zero as well. So
going back to your point about the FMVs and the use of kind of live action, it's an interesting thing if we're going to start talking about like the atmosphere of the first game and then the kind of trilogy, how it works, and it's so hard to explain. You're right; it's very much a product of its time, and yet it's something that you can look back on somewhat objectively and say, yes, that's good. And yet I remember when like Remake 3 came out and they did use live action in the opening bit with John, what's his name? Dr.
Matt Gorkis.
Thank you. How it felt off. And it's like, well, hold on. Why does that feel off in 2020? But yet in 1996, it felt right. And it added to the storyline. It added, even though you're playing it and you're trying to tell yourself, I'm going from, this Chris live action character that I can see, I'm suddenly supposed to believe that he's now this polygonal character with funny arms in the mansion. And yet you did. You went, yes, of course it's the same person.
I think it's that technology at the time thing. I mean, I'll let the other guys say what they think, but I mean, it's just, you just accepted it because you knew what gameplay characters looked like, and you just kind of accepted that it was going to be a video sequence, and then it might be in CG or it might be in live action, depending on the game. It's just that's how it was presented. And sometimes these things didn't really quite line up with their graphics, but I think in this day and age, like in the sense of the Resident Evil 3 remake, we have advanced technology enough that character didn't need to be live action. Like, it could have just done an animated character and you would have been like, cool, that's consistent. And it just seems jarringly weird to do real video these days, unless of course the whole game uses that element. That's a good point. I kind of know how to answer that. I don't know what the other guys think.
I think regardless, they made the right choice to dispense with the live-action intros for the second and third games. Even though it was quirky and it was effective at the time, it was still, even back in 1996, it was still a bit like, it's not great, really, is it?
and that's a holdover of that CD era where like heaps of games, as I said, were doing this, and it was because it was heavy budget item to do a CG thing, and of course by the time they made the sequel, they had the budget for it. But I couldn't imagine them trying to do the scale of that opening in live action in the second one either, and doing it justice either. So
No,
you're 100% right. Like,
and it, as you say, it kind of worked within what it was going for. It was going for that B movie cheesy feel that made you feel very uneasy, and it's notable by the fact that the remake didn't even try to do live action, and it's what makes the original game so unique. It wasn't great, and you kind of like chuckle at it, but at the same time it feels right. It's just the overall package. I love the first. I'm sorry, I won't hear a bad word against it. I think it's such a masterpiece in what it wants to do. The vision is so clear that I think if the game had literally started with just in the main hall, it wouldn't have been half as effective. And the fact that the opening FMV of Resident Evil doesn't even show a zombie. It's about a zombie dog. It's the first thing you see in Resident Evil is a dog. It's not the zombie, and it's odd. And it shouldn't work. I don't know. It's crazy, and I love it. I love it.
Did Alone in the Dark feature any kind of jump scare moments, like the dog coming through the window, or is that very much a Resident Evil thing?
I feel like that's a very Resident Evil thing. It's not like everyone turns around these days and goes, oh, there was that moment in Alone in the Dark where blah happened. But that was because at the time Alone in the Dark was a much more plodding game, but that's because in 1992 you didn't have the technology. I mean, the jump to PlayStation as well made that change with the raw horsepower of the console, allowed them to do something with a consistent frame rate to allow you to have a certain amount of enemies and stuff on screen at the same time, and that's something Alone in the Dark couldn't have done in its time. And even with its sequel, they came up with a second one. Technically, they came up with two sequels. There was a Christmas spin-off of the first one and a sequel at the year after 93. But again, it's still 93. So no, it just didn't have that. It didn't have that chance to have an impact. I mean, had they made another Alone in the Dark in 1996 with that technology and there was no Resident Evil, maybe that game would have been, again, much like I was saying before, a different game like Clock Tower could have been that thing. Another Alone in the Dark sequel could have jumped off that genre as well. But I mean, it's worth thinking about later on when they did do another Alone in the Dark game, that it was very much more inspired by a Resident Evil sort of feel and the way its combat worked and its exploration. When they released the new Nightmare in 2001, it was very much, you could feel it was no longer, this is Alone in the Dark inspired by Alone in the Dark. This is Alone in the Dark inspired by Resident Evil at this point.
I think that's a key component as well. You're right, John, about the original trilogy. It's got so many classic moments that still live on to this day that you feel Capcom always trying to not necessarily chase it, but later games don't quite have the same impact. So like, yes, dog bursting through the window, the liquor on the ceiling, Nemesis bursting through the window as well.
Even the CG, the hunter cutscene.
The hunter cutscene, yeah.
Just all these things that just made that so iconic, I guess.
The remake of the first game has been my default game for a number of years now, so I don't really play the original much, but I played the Seamless HD just this last week. Really enjoyed it, but I'd forgotten just the sense of dread you feel when you get back to the mansion after the guardhouse when the hunters are there and that music track plays. That's just not there in the remake. Well, it is in the remake, but it's not as effective, I should say. But little moments like that just make that first game so special.
It's interesting and somewhat controversially, but I think in the last few years we've started to see a shift of people moving more to the OG in terms of preference. I don't know why or how it's really happened. I wonder if it's because it has been so unavailable that people have created like this kind of
aura
in their head, and now it's available. It's like, oh my god, it's finally it's here and it's amazing kind of thing. But it's so nice to see like how well received the GOG version's been, and just I should highlight to Capcom just how much they've been fools for keeping it from the public for so long.
People will buy it. People will buy it. This is the thing.
The thing is, at least Resident Evil 1 has still been available in some capacity through the PSN for the last couple of years. It's going to be so fucking brilliant to get 2 and 3 into people's hands again. Finally get those games back out in an official capacity.
And what about Resident Evil 2 then? 1998. Surely Resident Evil 2 must be one of the first examples of a big budget horror video game sequel.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was. People didn't expect Resident Evil to be the smash success it was. So just like every other genre, when you get something that's successful, it takes a few years before you really start to see like I guess, for lack of a term, the copycats or the people who take inspiration or whatever. So, yeah, but even with the delays over 1.5's version and so forth, because obviously they were expecting to have the sequel out within about a year of the original, there wasn't really any too much out there for quite a while. And then, of course, Resident Evil 2 in itself became a trendsetter because it was more action-oriented. It's still horror, but it still had more action than the original. It took itself more seriously. It wore some of its influences more in its sleeve. Like, you can clearly see some direct stuff like aliens in there and a bit of other things in the narrative. But it's definitely, again, like such a solid sequel that it's what really made the franchise. Like, I know it sounds really crazy, but it's kind of like what Sean was alluding to earlier. I mean, when the first game came out, it was just the first game, and it was going to live or die on that sequel as a franchise, right? So the fact that came out and was a massive success. Like, it's hard to understate to people because, like, it's sold by today's numbers, it's paltry. It's like, I think it sold like 1 million, and this, not even 1 million. It was like hundreds of thousands of copies in a weekend or whatever in its launch. But it was like the biggest game financially at that point, success wise. It's the sort of numbers that one game might do in just one territory now for a big enough title. But back then, it was insane. Like, just absolutely insane, that the marketing for that sequel, the hype, the magazine coverage, all that sort of stuff. And it definitely left a massive wake behind it.
I agree. And I was just a shame I missed it out because I went 1, 3, then back to 2, but neither here nor there. But I mean, it's very much like that there is a feeling of, what could have been with 1.5, and I know there's a lot of love for 1.5.
No.
And I can understand why, but at the same time, 1.5, 100% the right decision to start again. From what we've played, I know it wasn't the full game, but from what you can play, it just lacked a lot of heart compared to 2.
I think that's the damning thing. It's like, if you read the interviews, you read the discussions around why they cancelled it, what they were feeling about the gameplay, and then you actually play that build, you go, yeah, I feel that. It's not bullshit. It makes sense what they said at the time, and what they have continued, people who have been asked about have continued to say to this day, is it wasn't quite coming together. It wasn't what they had thought it was going to be. And I can guarantee you we would not be sitting here right now talking about this franchise if that game had come out. If that game had come out, it wouldn't be the franchise it is.
I find it baffling that you still read online discourse where people are like, I really wish this had been the version that got released. I'm sorry, but I'm going to trust the game's own director, who's humble enough to admit it wasn't working.
Yeah, it takes a lot of balls to do that and basically start it again. It was 70% complete, wasn't it? 1.5.
Between 60 and 80, I think it was.
Yeah, average about, they reckon, about 70%. And it was months away from being supposed to be released. Like 3 months, I think, was the goal. 3 to 4 months.
But what we got was just, it's a bit like what Alien and Aliens is, isn't it? In terms of like just high quality. I mean, 1998 was a golden year for video games. And this was the beginning, wasn't it? Was it January 98?
Yeah.
I've talked about this so many times before, but 1998 is the year that I hold on the pedestal as the year everything changed. It was the year where I think narrative-based storytelling really turned a corner and went for it, because the games that came out that year are so important, and the DNA I feel is still felt today. Whether it's like your cinematic storytelling games like Resident Evil 2, I mean, people have to bear in mind, we'd never seen anything like the Hunk versus Birkin sequence back then. Like, from just a purely directorial point of view, a perfect marriage of like soundtrack and visuals and direction, like that sequence was so far beyond what anybody else was doing at the time. Some of the sequences in Resident Evil 2 are mind blowing, but it was also the year like things like Ocarina of Time came out and Metal Gear Solid came out. If I need to explain to people like how much Metal Gear Solid changed shit, Half-Life came out, and that changed everything we knew about first-person games in terms of how scripting used to work, how you were actually moving physically through a narrative that was changing and unfolding around you in real-time 3D. All this stuff just happened all at the same time, and it was absolutely amazing. And if we're talking about it with regards to the horror genre, you've got Parasite Eve coming out this year as well. And that, the first time anybody laid eyes on those FMVs in Parasite Eve, where you're watching a literal opera house burst into flames with that soundtrack, it's just like, my God, gaming has changed. We're not just Sonic the Hedgehog running around Green Hill Zone anymore.
Yeah.
These are adult stories being played out now.
That's 100% right, Sean. I mean, it was such a weird thing because I remember 97 as like starting to feel some of these weird shifts of things that hadn't quite coalesced. And there's still elements of 97 that are monumental, like GoldenEye came out out that year, and some of the shifts of things that came in there. But 98 was not like any other year before it. It was where people had started to become au fait with the technology they were working with, where they were to push new creative bounds with new stories and narratives, and really that was the beginning of the cinematic era. And Resident Evil 2 was at that forefront, being at the start of the year. It really blew the gates out that year. And Final Fantasy VII had come out in Japan, but it came out in elsewhere as well. Like, just that epic level of storytelling, music and narrative and videos and full motion video cutscenes and all that stuff that started to blend the idea of games that started to draw you in like a movie would, but gave you satisfying gameplay, really started to coalesce that year. I can't agree more.
That's certainly the case with Resident Evil 2. I mean, it's basically everything that's good about the first game times by 10. You know, the horror, the gameplay was refined and tweaked, the options for the players, you know, the fact that you had the zapping system as it was dubbed at the time, and, you know, this storyline that was like, well, do you remember the mansion incident? Yeah, it's like that, but the whole city, and you are thrown into the middle of it, and then you kind of get hints of what's going on. Then, as Sean says, you get that amazing FMV that kind of explains that there's another virus being released, and you go through this absolutely epic adventure with equally as memorable soundtracks and villains, and, you know, updates of, instead of hunters, you've got the lickers, and you've now got big plants, you know, based on the first game, and, you know, plant things and spiders and moths, and it's just, you know, crescendos in this amazing end, you know, self-destruct sequence and in the labs and escaping the train. You go, oh, thank God for that. Only to be said, oh, now chuck in disc 2 or disc 1 and do it all again. And you're like, okay.
I can't stress what that was like. I remember my brain, I think, actually blew apart. Because everybody knew, anyone who played the PlayStation version knew there was 2 campaigns, by virtue of the fact that there was just simply 2 discs in the box, and each one, you know, and one had Leon on it, one had Claire on it. And if you were careful enough to read some early reviews and things like that in PlayStation Magazine, then you knew you had to play both discs at some point. But I will never forget the first time I put disc 2 in, thinking it was going to be essentially the same game.
What we
you know, I
remake.
thought I was going to literally play through the same events again, and then the opening title started, and I remember it's burned into my brain, and it's like, at the same time, at the same place, you have to survive this nightmare to know the true end. And I was like, the true end? What are you fucking talking about? And then fucking Mr. X turns up, man.
Yeah.
And it's just, oh my God, this is the best thing I've ever played in my entire life. It's just the boldness of it, the bravery of it. You just had to have been there, guys. It's just, honestly.
If I could sum up that moment, it would be the Chris Pratt gif from Parks and Recreation.
The cruel irony is, Resident Evil 2's remake's version of Scenarios is exactly what I thought we were going to get. I thought we were going to just literally get the same game again, but just with a couple of bits bolted on. The entire fucking thing's completely reworked, and it's so genius.
It is. And then to do the same cutscenes, well, not cutscenes, but, you know, the in-game cutscenes at, like, the STARS office, and you're doing it again, but you're doing it from the other perspective, and you think, you had never seen anything like that itself, you know, and the idea that, oh, yeah, I did leave the submachine gun. I did, you know, and I thought, why did I don't know? You just left it. You go, oh my God, I can pick that up. And then, you know, you're getting the other end of the radio calls, and you're like, this is mind-blowingly incredible.
It truly was. Like, even TV and stuff weren't doing, like, integrated universes and you know, seeing events from 2 perspectives like this game was. You know, obviously TV does it now with spin-offs and all sorts of, you know, Marvel Cinematic Universes where you get to sometimes see the same events from 2 perspectives. I suppose, you know, quirkily enough, the closest comparison I think I have at the time is probably Back to the Future 2, where you got to see an event from a slightly different angle or perspective.
Yeah, it was not a common thing like that at all. Not at all.
Resident Evil 2 was mind-blowing. My first experience with Resident Evil 2, because I didn't obviously have a PlayStation at the time, and it was actually before it had come out, was a friend of mine in the village I lived in had a PlayStation. And I sometimes used to go around and we used to just play on his PlayStation. And he got PlayStation Magazine, and he got the PlayStation Magazine demo, the 10-minute demo.
Nice.
And that was, I think, a lot of people's first exposure to the game. And by that point, I was sort of really well rehearsed on Resident Evil. I knew how it worked. And I just used to challenge myself on that demo to see how far I could get each time. And, you know, I was able to get a little bit further each time, and I managed to get back to the main hall to get the key to run back up. And I'd, you know, go and use the crank and get the stairwell down in the clock, you know, like the bell tower room. And, you know, it was so exciting just to play it over and over and over again.
There was a cut-off point, isn't there?
Yeah, the cutoff point was that it was 10 minutes, but do you know where the cutoff point was if you had no clock?
I know. I remember there used to be a very famous action replay code where you could disable the timer, but I never know where it actually ended now.
It ends when you go to the basement of the police station.
Oh,
so
okay.
when you get to the back
a
of the
reasonable amount then.
Yeah, you can. That's a good chunk of Leon's part of the first part of his campaign. Yeah, it gets to the stair loading on the going down to the basement stairs and then locks up on the stair.
Take your mind back, guys. Obviously, back in the day, whenever you got a sequels back in like the Mega Drive era were basically the same game, but were obviously refined or maybe looked a bit better and whatnot. How was it for you guys the first time you picked up Resident Evil 2 to find none of your characters returned? Did it bother you?
It bothered me, yeah.
Did it?
I thought it was very ballsy because like you got so attached to Chris and Jill, and I'm like, who the fuck's Leon? But it obviously worked out for the best. It was an amazingly brave decision, I think.
Like just that opening scene, it's like explaining what's been going on, and it's like, okay, so this is connected, but we're playing different characters. What?
Elsa Walker was supposed to be a brand new character, didn't they? They wanted to connect it a little bit, so they made it. So
I think that was a perfect decision. That was by having Claire in there. Really, it gave it that narrative connection.
That was the thing, that the 1.5 version had no connections other than being in Raccoon City, and so that was one of the feedback things that they got for the script, was that it didn't have enough connection to the original at all, and so that was the idea, to have a character that was related to one of the ones, and a couple of the other changes that were made to referencing events and connections to Umbrella and so forth that were from the original. And clearly so, there's enough little connective tissue to make it.
Yeah, playing as these new characters was disappointing, but you still felt the presence of the old characters in the files and stuff, and there was something about, being in the STARS office for the first time and seeing the desks, seeing Jill's beret and Chris's jacket and the STARS photo on the wall. Resident Evil 2 really did an amazing job of really expanding the whole world.
And Ada, don't forget Ada, of course.
Yeah.
That was a lovely link.
It's continuing that cinematic link, when you get a movie that makes reference, a sequel that makes reference to its original, or continue stuff. And not all sequels work the same way with direct characters. I mean, most do, but there were some movies out there where you'd have different character events or different characters, but they would still allude to that thing. And again, it just was such a clever, cinematic sort of styling, and really doubled down on all that sort of elements, being in direct, kind of stylistic references and tone and even the marketing, doing the Romero commercial and all that sort of stuff, really pushing that sort of angle for a bit more action, but still there.
I remember playing the demo with Director's Cut, going through every possible way. And I think that ended with Ada, meeting Ada in the garage, I think.
Yeah, I know, it's in the STARS office. She shoots
in the STARS office, that's right, yeah. And I remember watching that and thinking, right, I need to go and rent Assault on Precinct 13 and watch that. And you could quite clearly see where the influence was coming from there.
Yeah, definitely agree with that.
I'm afraid in answer to your question, Sean, I did Resident Evil 3 before I did 2, so I got my Jill fix.
That's true. Yeah, very
so I was quite happy in that sense.
Why did you skip 2 then? What was the?
Because I was playing 1. Because I said 2 was just about to come out when I got the original game, so I was late. So
and you weren't inspired to go?
No, famously, in my head anyway, I got to the guardhouse and gave up because I was just too scared to carry on. I'm like, no, that's it, I'm done. I got to the point where I was like, I can't carry on. I was too uneasy.
I thought you were going to say it was the book puzzle in the guardhouse or something, Nick.
No, so it took me a long time to actually complete Resident Evil, and it was only when Resident Evil, I think 3 came out, so a long time.
99 by that point.
It was,
yeah. No, hang on. You're in a PAL territory, so it would be 2000 by the time.
Was it No.
Yeah, it was. It was February 2000.
Infamously got delayed because Capcom switched from Virgin to Eidos.
Eidos, yeah, that's right.
And Eidos delayed the game so it didn't clash with Tomb Raider, which was coming out Christmas 99.
My cousin had Resident Evil 2, actually, and he used to bring it around, and I used to watch a little bit of it. So I was aware of it, but that kind of inspired me to kind of complete 1, and then by that time I knew 3 was coming out, so I picked up 3. So I got that, and it was 3 that really grabbed me into the series. And then I went back and picked up 2. So I got my Jill fix a bit earlier on. So I hold 3 very differently. I don't have the same feelings that you have towards 2, just because I didn't experience that level of awesomeness until much later on, if you know what I mean. It's like, oh my god, it's so cool.
That still must be a very unique experience, though, because for the rest of us, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but Resident Evil 3, as awesome as it was, it did feel like a little bit of an anticlimax compared to the second one, because there was only one campaign, it was so shorter, and you went back to sort of recycled environments. So, you getting to play 3 first is probably a special thing.
It made 2 feel really long, but in a really positive way, because 3 has such an epic ending that not even 2 tops. This kind of culmination with Barry coming to rescue you, the city blowing up, the famously brilliant music at the end. It's like, oh my god, what's going to top that? And the answer is nothing tops that ending. And yet, when you play 2, you get the better campaign, I would suggest. The better in-game narrative.
I guess that is the one benefit of playing 2 before 3 in its order, is that it kind of, at least even if the narrative of 3 is shorter and it's a much more straightforward game, it does culminate in the end of that sort of arc.
Yeah.
Whereas having the destruction of Raccoon and then going back to experience that other bit of the story is a little bit jarring in some respects, but yet these days that's taken for granted. You could do that anyway with remakes and narratives and jumping around and all that sort of stuff.
I recall almost being, people will swear murder at me for this, but being almost disappointed by the first sort of hour or so of Resident Evil 3. As much as it was fun and it was zappy and it played really well, and that opening FMV to that game is extraordinary. But I remember just running around the city streets thinking, this is not really any different from RE2. It just feels like a more extended section of like some of the street sequences in RE2. That was all silenced, thankfully, once we got to the clock tower, and then I think the game ups a gear that carries on all the way for the rest of the game.
Inherently, these days, you would almost look at 3 as like a DLC for 2 rather than its own game. If you were to talk about a game that came out now, companies would have considered releasing 3 as an add-on, almost in some respects, to 2 than it would be its own fledgling full title.
If they'd released the remakes as like, instead of calling it 2 and 3, called it Resident Evil Raccoon City or whatever, and Jill's was the 3rd campaign, I think people would have probably been a lot warmer to it.
That's possibly true as well.
Didn't CVX Freak say in his book as well that it was originally supposed to end at the clock tower, the game?
Yeah, it seems insane. And didn't they make it with like 3 months to spare, the Dead Factory?
Yeah.
And the partner is incredible.
The game wasn't even supposed to be 3 to begin with in the same respect, so...
I mean, I have a lot of fond memories of 3. As I said, I'd seen a lot of 2, by the way, so it's not as if I was completely oblivious to it, so I knew what was going on. But the Nemesis dropping down in the courtyard, and you go, oh my god, the end boss, what's he doing here? That kind of thing. And then suddenly, oh no, you will be fighting him now. That was new, that was unique. And then getting into the hall, exploring the RPD again, and then hearing the music of the Nemesis, and then that being your music cue that, oh crap, So that holds a very special place, because that was better stalker enemy than Mr. X, in my opinion. And you're right that there's a lot of artificial padding in there's lots of like, go back here, get the crank. Oh, the crank, the wrench is broke. Now you go that, and it's all a little bit padded out. But I think the atmosphere of 3 remains a series highlight. That feeling of desolation.
It's interesting to think about in this, because I do like the feeling of 3, and I've always maintained that an open city kind of Resident Evil where you explored, and tried to survive and escape, where you had scope and scale, would be a very interesting game to play. And there's been shades of that to come through some games. Like you could almost say, some respects, the Tall Oak section of Resident Evil 6 is a little bit like that.
Yeah.
Parts of Operation Raccoon City, of course, but a full-fledged kind of survival game. I mean, that's a classic title that we didn't talk about at the start, was when Ubisoft returned to it, was Zombie, which they called Zombie U on the Wii U.
Yeah.
That was based on an old game called Zombie, and it was a horror game of in the 80s. And that had that element of trying to escape, for a narrative of London, but you had kind of it was somewhat linear, but there was a little bit of free open range to it. And I remember playing that and going, like, a Resident Evil game of this sort of style would have been amazing, at some point, but not now, but at that time. It's that same thing. I remember taking my time with Resident Evil 3. 2, a friend and I sat down. It's funny because I was listening to Sean before talking about, the amazingness of like all these scenarios. I remember my friend came around and literally stayed the whole weekend, and we played through all the scenarios in one weekend. Like when it came out, we were obsessed. We played through all of one, then we played through all the A scenario, B scenario, then we switched it over and played the A and B reversed. And I just remember being so excited and just like plowing my way through that game. But when it came to 3, I remember knowing it was going to be a shorter game, so I remember taking my time and playing through it in small stages and not rushing as much. And so I think for me as well, that sort of memory of it is that I took time and explored and looked around and took in the atmosphere, perhaps more than I had when I'd first played 2 for the first time ever, even though by the time I played 3, I played through 2 millions of times probably.
There is something unique about the Nemesis that although what it does isn't that new, obviously it stood the test of time. The Nemesis is probably next to the Licker, the most iconic BOW, I mean, apart from Zombie, if you like. But, it kind of does everything that Birkin and Mr. X kind of do, but better. So, Birkin constantly kind of follows you and, it won't die. Mr. X stalks you throughout RPD and the labs or whatnot. But the way the Nemesis does it, and we've spoken about it before, it's just this unrelenting creature that will do absolutely anything to kill you. It builds up his personality as a creature, something which you kind of get hints of in Birkin. But the Nemesis has it, it's like by the end of it, you dare say you feel a little bit sorry for it when you finally blast him with the Magnum. You're like, oh well, never mind.
He broke all the rules, didn't he? It's obviously that unscripted element to him, which makes pretty much every playthrough unique. And you play it yourself, and when you first encounter him, you think, yeah, I know how these video games work. I'll just run away into the next room and I'll be safe. And fucking hell, he just follows you, doesn't he? And that was just new at the time. Mr. X, as effective as he was in the second game, he was all about the jump scares where he'd crash through the wall, but he'd always appear in the same places. And
yeah, it was scripted as such, but Nemesis had a script, but it was a loose script of he will turn up here and then he will react to the player's actions, which is a very different kettle of fish.
Yeah,
very much so.
And it was particularly exciting that because you had these live selections and there was a degree of choice as to where you went. So if you went to the garage or if you went to the sales office, actual playthroughs were inherently different. And even today, people are still finding things. Every now and again, someone, did you know this? And everyone's like, no. Whether it would be like the baby drain demios that no one really knew about in the eggs hatching, or the hunters being able to basically do a singing in the rain style swirl around a lamppost and then decapitate you, or shooting some of the lampposts, light bulbs and things like that. People, are always finding new things about 3. It's a testament to that particular game that it holds a very dear place.
I think that's something else I want to go back to and talk about 1 as well, is that there's all those different path options and cutscenes and things that you wouldn't know about, and not everyone got the same experience. And I think those elements also added to the mystique of these 3 games, is that, especially in a pre or early internet era, they were the sorts of things that you would talk about with your friends that were playing the games, and someone might get stuck or someone would talk about something. I have this clear, vivid memory of a friend of mine, asking about like what he did with the Doom books in Resident Evil 1 because he got stuck, and it's like what you said, Nick, where you got stuck because it was too kind of scary and I didn't want to continue on. Like other people had those, I had those same stories when some people were like, oh, I'm really enjoying it, but I can't, it was too hard, it was too scary, I didn't like it too much. Like I like it, but I don't know if I like it enough to continue right now. It's kind of a bit too much. It's too much for me, kind of thing. And I think these all added to its mystique in it as well. Like when I think about it, like just those changes and those things, those experiences that people could have differently as well.
So what about Resident Evil's big budget rival then in 1999, Silent Hill?
Well, yeah, so that's kind of a nice segue then into generally what happened with the success of the OG trilogy and or other, and its games, 1 or 2, and then that led into other games being developed as a direct result. And Silent Hill is 100% the best place to start. I have a very mixed relationship with Silent Hill, but I will come back to mine. Who wants to kick off with Silent Hill 1?
I remember being quite dismissive of it. I think by that point I had some early Resident Evil fanboyism that I kind of, like, it's so petty, but I was a very young teenager at the time, and I remember thinking, I'm not interested in this shit. Look at those fucking visuals with the fog. You can't see fuck all, and obviously now I look back and think it's absolute genius of Konami to, take what they were doing at the time. But I just think I was so enamored with like those FMV backgrounds being so beautifully detailed. that when you saw Silent Hill, I mean, we obviously admire what Konami did with the terms of the technology, but it was a rough-looking video game even back then. With like the dithering and everything like that, gave it a very rough presentation. It obviously works in its favor of what it was trying to do, but because of this stupid twattish fanboy elitism I had at the time, I didn't dabble with Silent Hill until many years later, which I kick myself now because obviously that also means I didn't play, Silent Hill 2 until about 12, 13 years after it had come out. And now I look back, and I just think what a fucking idiot I was, because Silent Hill 2 is one of my favourite games of all time.
I assume, like many, did you play Silent Hill first on the Metal Gear Solid package?
Yeah, which was an amazing demo, that was.
Yeah.
And obviously, in this country, it was, they still retained the weird baby-like monsters in the school, as opposed to the things they turned them into. The sort of baby things with knives.
Oh, right, okay.
In that demo, when you're running around the school, they're changed in the Western copies of the actual final release.
No, it's only changed in the PAL version.
Is it the PAL version? Is it? Okay.
PAL version and the Japanese version, actually. It's only the US that has that, interestingly enough.
They changed those monsters, Nick, into some weird little clawed creature.
Kind of like a bear with claws.
Yeah.
I share your sentiment, Sean. I was quite elitist as well with game, and we'll talk about Dino Crisis as well, which obviously made by Capcom as well. I kind of dismissed that, and I love dinosaurs, and I was like, no. I remember for Dino Crisis thinking, I wish this was a Resident Evil game.
That though, I will say, when I did actually sit down and play that demo on the Metal Gear Solid demo of Silent Hill, I will concede, even then it was fucking terrifying.
I think I played it once when Metal Gear came out. I played it, and I have the same feelings as you. I remember going, this looks terrible. But I remember it being marketed going, oh, forget those silly pre-rendered backgrounds of Resident Evil. This is full 3D. And I was like, oh, okay. And I played it going, well, this looks, really awful. And I like the music a lot. But again, even like the cutscenes I felt looked worse than Resident Evil 2. They've got an artistic style, and I shouldn't criticise, but you're younger at that point, and graphics meant everything.
It's also because you don't know the artistry that's gone behind it. I'll come back to that actually.
Yeah, no, exactly. I didn't know. You were just playing a game, and I thought the FMVs look a bit crap, and the game looks a bit poor, so I dismissed it. And I thought that. And I think I've said it before. The only reason I got back into it, because of the movie.
I think the main reason why Silent Hill worked for me was the sound design. The crackling radio and everything like that. And there's a weird tone that runs through the school. Once it's turned to like the dark world, you get this just like this, I'm going to do a terrible job of it, but it's like this dung, 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 dung in the background. And it's really weird and fucked up. And despite the fact that I was very dismissive of it, the unsettling feeling that this game, like if Resident Evil just purely relied on jump scares, this was a game that even back then with its technology of the PlayStation 1, it got under your skin in a different kind of way and was unforgettable, even as much as I was dismissing it. I still remember in my brain like it was last week, that first time playing through that demo and being like, again, we talked about it earlier, but you feel like the evil permeating through the game, and Silent Hill does this so brilliantly. Like, there's nothing like a classic Team Silent Hill game. They were masters at what they did.
Yeah, so I watched the movies. I've written the first movie. I know it seems odd, and I really liked. I really liked the movie. I don't know why I went to see it. That's the funny thing. I don't know why I did, but I really liked it. And the weekend after, I went to Game Station and bought Silent Hill, and then Silent Hill: The Collection on PlayStation 2, which I foolishly sold years later, which I shouldn't have done. And I thought, no, I'm going to do this in chronological order. And apart from the demo, I knew nothing bar Sean Bean.
The quote that goes on the box. I knew nothing but Sean Bean. God.
But credit to the movie for making me actually want to get me interested in the. I know the movie's not the best. I think it's great, but it captured my imagination.
Tell you what, Nick, challenge someone to say that about the Resident Evil movies, hey?
Yeah, exactly. I think it'd be harder to find someone who'd watched the RE movies and wanted to play the games. But anyway,
I really love that aesthetic. I want to play a game, and then they play the game, and it's like, oh, this isn't like the movies at all.
So I was playing Silent Hill 1. So whatever year the Silent Hill movie came out, I was playing Silent Hill 1.
06, I think.
PS1 game in 2006. So, by which point graphics are on a whole new level. And I was playing it on the PS2. And I have never felt more petrified playing a video game than Silent Hill 1. As Sean says, that unnerving feel, that genius use of fog, it is still the most scariest experience I've had in horror gaming, and I have completed it, and I'm never playing it again. It was genuinely terrifying, and I love it, and I haven't sold it because I thought it was just, it's as clunky, it's terrible controls. Anyone who thinks it's got, it's the same controls as RE is like this thing on ice compared to Silent Hill. The menu's diabolical, in my opinion, but I thought it was terrifyingly good, just for the atmosphere alone. I didn't actually like Silent Hill 2 and 3 and 4 as much. I know, but that's my Silent Hill escapade.
John?
You brought it up, John.
I've got the same opinion as you, to be honest. I thought it was good, it was enjoyable. I sought it out simply because I was desperate for another Resident Evil fix at the time. But like you guys have already said, because the graphics were 3D and not pre-rendered, it didn't look as good. The fog element, whilst interesting, I found it frustrating because you literally couldn't see enough, in my opinion. But I persevered with it. I remember completing it. I think I completed it 2 or 3 times. I wanted to get the alien abduction comical ending, but I don't know. It just never really had the same effect for me. I think it's because I was so enamoured with the Resident Evil storyline, because it was kind of the X-Files approach of it was semi-realistic science, what if, rather than a straight-up supernatural horror. And I also liked the conspiracy element with Umbrella. So the Silent Hill story, whilst interesting, it just never really gripped me as much as Resident Evil did. And like you said, the controls were a bit clunky. The characters, whilst interesting, they just weren't on the same level as the likes of Chris and Jill for me. I don't think I ever actually finished Silent Hill 2. Wow. I don't think I played the 3rd one. I remember buying the 4th one thinking, yeah, this is interesting, but I don't think I even got out of the apartment.
I played 1, then I played 3, because I read that's the follow-up. I played 3 and I found that interesting. It was okay.
At the time, I just wanted another Resident Evil experience, and rather than Silent Hill, I was more drawn to, a couple of years later, this will be, Alone in the Dark, The New Nightmare, which was very, very much like the original Resident Evil, but with a fresh coat of paint, so to speak. The visuals and the atmosphere in A New Nightmare were excellent. And I remember playing that at the time thinking, God, if they ever do sort of remaster Resident Evil or remake it, this is what it should look like.
Not even knowing that less than a year away was going to happen.
Yeah, I can't remember if it had already been announced by that point.
I don't think it had, because New Nightmare was delayed. It ended up coming out. It was a weird kind of, like, it was supposed to be on PlayStation, then it got so delayed it ended up on, like, the PS2 as well. Because I've got both the PS1 and the PS2 copy, funnily enough. But yeah, it was a weird thing. I don't think it was. I think it came out before the announcement.
But I just remember it obviously had the same mansion setting, but you started outside the mansion in, like, the grounds, and it was raining, and I think, did that have pre-rendered graphics? I can't remember.
Yeah, it's pre-rendered. Same, very much. Like, it's like a combination of a hark back to its origins, and then very much inspired by the influences and changes and modernization that Resident Evil brought.
It had the zapping system as well, didn't it, with the 2 campaigns? Yeah.
Yep, 100%.
Yeah, I'd very much recommend that game if you want an old school Resident Evil experience.
And it's currently, you can download it on, if you want to buy it, you can buy it, or if you've got PlayStation Plus Deluxe, I think it's on the PlayStation Store right now as a PS2 Classic. You can or PS1 Classic, you can play it exactly. It's got trophies and everything there. Ridiculous.
Rob.
So, similar to you guys, my first experience with it was the demo with Metal Gear Solid, and I rented Metal Gear Solid. This is a bit of a story. I will try and do it in the shortest time possible. In 1999, there was a worldwide virus called the Chernobyl virus. I don't know if everyone remembers this at all. It was a PC virus that happened on the date of Chernobyl in April. And I was playing through Metal Gear Solid at the time, and so I just spent a lot of time playing Metal Gear Solid because my computer had died and I couldn't use my computer. I was waiting for it to be repaired, and it was going to take a few days. There was a backlog of other people who had been impacted. So I basically blitzed my way through the rest of Metal Gear Solid that I had left. And the demo was in there, and I was like, Silent Hill, what is this? Hadn't really read much about it. Chucked the demo in, played it, and I was like, oh, this is like psychological horror, like, your mixture of like horror authors. I was all over it, because much like the cinema elements it was for Resident Evil in 96 for me, I was still now in this phase of like reading a lot of like, horror novels and the sort of thing like Bachman King and like, all that sort of stuff that was referenced. There's some Twin Peaks elements in there. There's all these like things that were all touchstones for things that I also enjoyed. So I had this experience all over again, essentially, that I had with Resident Evil, that this game was coming out that it was the right game again at the right time, and I loved the horror elements, and I thought it was great. I loved the aesthetic. You guys are like, oh, it looked terrible, but I think it was part of its charm. And to the point now, ironically, where I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but there's been a trend in the last year or two of like these retro horror games that are stylized like a PS1 title in full 3D. Slightly more sharper, and without like the texture warping and stuff, but very much drawn mostly on the aesthetics of Silent Hill. It's been insane. I can't believe it. I never would have thought I would have ever seen this happen, but it has.
Boomer shooters. Some of them are called boomer shooters.
No, not the boomer shooters. They're more like Doom and all that sort of stuff. But there's some actual horror games that have the aesthetics of a PS1 title, like the texture, pixelation, and all that sort of stuff. Like, I'm trying to remember the name of it, but there's a bunch of them out there, and it's become a sort of touchstone to have these PS1 graphics, and especially with horror titles, because much like the game, there's a certain hinting of something without being too explicit. So if something looks kind of like blood, it's kind of pixelated, so it's blood enough, but you can kind of get away with, like, it's like your imagination is as bad as potentially what it could actually be, and if not worse so. And I love that element, and I love the mystery behind the fact that there's not a full explanation to the story. Like, things are hinted at and not fully realized. They left to the player's interpretation, or their understanding of the narrative, or their understanding of the conversations between the characters. And I love the conversations where they weren't like top tier acting or anything, but they weren't bad either, and it kind of left this still level of ambiguity between character relationships. And I just again love that for the dynamic of the type of game it was. And I didn't mind the gameplay. Like, I was clunky, I can definitely admit that, but I kind of found that endearing. Like, I got the idea that this guy is not supposed to be, he's not Chris, he's not Jill, he's not a trained person, he's just using items around him, and he's not really good at fighting. And it kind of worked to its aesthetic, to the point where when they made the sequel, they made that a real like selling point. They were like, this guy's just a regular guy, he doesn't really fire properly, you know. And so I really loved it. I was all over that, as much as I was Resident Evil at the time, to the point where before I made a Resident Evil website, I made a Silent Hill website in 99. So, you know, I started from that origin and doing stuff. Like, I was working on other websites doing news and stuff for like horror gaming, but it was that game that really got me into pushing myself onto the internet, ironically. Again, funnily enough that I'm sitting here all these years later talking about Resident Evil endlessly, but Silent Hill was that thing that really pushed me onto the internet more so than I had been up until that point. So
from my point of view, that's what's turned me off Silent Hill, is that I needed answers.
Yeah.
Which is why I like 1 and 3, and then I played 2, and I was like, well, this has got nothing to do with Silent Hill. Where's my lesser background?
Yeah, well, it just had to do, there's a little bit to do with the cult, and that's about it. And
I can't be dealing with that.
A standalone is one of the best, as Sean's alluded to. It's like one of the amazingly aped narratives. It's such a iconic horror element story now that, much like Resident Evil, like so many people have taken inspiration from like the adult themes and that sort of stuff that came from it. But yeah, out of that era, I mean, the Silent Hill team themselves said they didn't come out of their way to make something that was supposed to compete with Resident Evil. They just wanted to make a horror title that was psychological and different. But of course, from a marketing perspective and from a company perspective, of course, the company wanted something that was like their version of Resident Evil, that differentiated itself, but like was able to compete. And for a period of time there, it looked like Silent Hill would be that, but it never sold the numbers Resident Evil did, and it has continued never to do so. But from a stylistic and impactful standpoint, it's had its own legs, which is impressive for a game that didn't do as well as a franchise, but it's still around, still keeps coming back. So pretty impressive for its time.
So let's have a look at some other games that were clearly influenced. So we can stick with Capcom then. We've quickly mentioned Dino Crisis, which was very much a Resident Evil clone, or if you like, using the same sort of engine. I own Dino Crisis 1, albeit on Pirate. And again, I love dinosaurs, I love Jurassic Park, and I love Resident Evil, so you think this is a marriage made in heaven. And yet, I wasn't gripped. I was never gripped by Dino Crisis. I never completed it.
It's a hard game. People may correct me, but I remember it being it's not very forgiving from a difficulty standpoint. I only ever played it once through on the PlayStation. I have the copy of it on the Dreamcast, which is really hard to find, apparently. I don't know if that's still the case, but it was.
Very well with that.
Which was the intent, because I bought it so I could replay it. What I remember was
pretty much.
There's some interesting factors. I'm pretty sure, someone will correct me if I'm wrong, I think Dino Crisis runs on the 1.5 engine.
Right.
Actually uses the base code for Resident Evil 1.5, because that was how early in development it was. It's obviously Mikami's his directorial follow-up to Resident Evil, and every region has different puzzles and answers, which is very unusual. So the PAL version and like the Japanese version and the US version all have different answers for all the puzzles. which makes it even more tough if you only play one of the other versions. That's all I can remember about it. I know it had to do with like time portals and dinosaurs coming through and a third energy or something like that, I think.
Yeah. Umbrella on some boxes. I remember that.
There's some Easter eggs and and Regina being the main cast member and her.
Well, we never got the demo, did we? I think in America they had the demo.
Came with Resident
3,
Evil 3, yeah.
And vice versa, didn't it? Dino Crisis came with 3.
Yeah, Dino Crisis was the demo for 3, and the sequel, interestingly, has been more influential not on the second one. I said sequel was 2 others, and I'll come back to the sequel has been more influential, ironically, on Resident Evil as a franchise. A lot of the gameplay elements went on to inspire things that Mikami and other teams would do with things like Resident Evil 4. Mercenaries, for example, the version of Mercenaries that's in 4 comes from very much the dynamic of the gameplay score point system of Dino Crisis 2. And there's even some music tracks that are taken from Dino Crisis 2 and put into that game. It's very much influential. There's other puzzle and gameplay elements that got taken from that too that got put into like Resident Evil 4 and future Resident Evil games. So it's quite interesting in that respect. But yeah, and it goes back to using pre-rendered backgrounds, which Dino Crisis 1 was 3D with like movable cameras. It was quite an interesting concept at the time because it had like dynamic cameras as well as static cameras. So that was them trying to experiment with the idea, but I think it was still too early, which again is probably what makes it a little bit hard. So by the time they made the sequel, they went back to pre-renders, which is kind of an interesting twist to go backwards. But I think it was because they wanted to do this like outdoor jungle area, and they couldn't really do that in a 3D environment. I don't even know if we really want to talk about Dino Crisis 3.
No.
The sad end of that franchise.
Well, I mean, Dino Crisis 3 is a great example of a franchise where you have this bonkers, outlandish idea for a sequel, and someone within your company, whether it's an executive producer or whatever, doesn't rein that in. Because that could have been Resident Evil. You know, Resident Evil has only ever been one poor decision away from extinction.
And it has gone pretty close to it a couple of times.
Yeah, all you needed was like a let's jump forward 150 years, narrative idea for Resident Evil 6 or something, and Resident Evil would not be here today.
And in Dino Crisis' case, it was dinos in space.
Yeah. But doesn't it take like a massive leap for like 200 years or something?
Yeah. Interestingly, the shooter, the Dino Gun Survivor 3, is more connected to the main narrative.
Funnily enough, I have still to this day never even played a second of a Dino Crisis game.
I highly recommend to everyone, especially if you like your traditional kind of like pre-rendered background games, to play 2. 2 is an amazing game, and no one played it because it came out at the end of the PS1 era and it didn't get a PS2 port or staged level. Kind of like Alone in the Dark, we were just talking about before, had a PS1 and a PS2 release. Dino Crisis 2 came out by the time the PS2 had started to come out everywhere, and not a lot of people played it, and it's really good. If you're wanting an old school kind of like third person pre-rendered background Resident Evil-esque action game, you could do a lot worse. It is a very good game.
Then a lot of our listeners will know that we big up the work of Gemini, RE behind the mask, who's obviously done the classic rebirths for the original Resident Evil trilogy, has also done the same work to Dino Crisis 2. So with a simple download and a DLL file that you drop into the install folder of Dino Crisis 2 on the PC, will work on all modern systems with your latest game controllers and things like that.
Highly recommend it then. Sean, I recommend it to you too then, if you can
okay.
play it. I honestly think you'll be surprised and enjoy it. I really do. I do think it.
Have we mentioned Parasite Eve?
We did. We talked about the cutscene. The sequel's really interesting because it's very much like the first one was like it had its inspirations in Resident Evil in the backgrounds and stuff, but it was an RPG and it worked like an RPG. But the sequel really felt like Resident Evil because they took the RPG elements, but they moved it into an environment where you didn't go from. You transitioned into a gameplay environment for Parasite Eve 1 where it was like a gritty kind of system and it was like a Final Fantasy or any other RPG that Squaresoft put out at the time. But 2 played like Resident Evil. You could kind of move around and stand and shoot, and you took points off while shooting, but it played like a Resident Evil game, and there was bosses and sub-bosses and harder enemy types, and it was a very different game to the original, but it felt more like it definitely was like, we want something that plays a bit more like a Resident Evil game than the first one did. So it's a very interesting sequel in that regard. And it's a good game. Like, they're both really solid. I mean, as much as Nick was, Sean was already talking about how good that first one is, especially the soundtrack and everything, but the second is a really solid sequel. And unfortunately, they never went and did it anymore after that. There's the Third Birthday. Yeah, isn't really a sequel. It is a sequel, but it's not really a true sequel. And it's a shame, because those first two games are really good for what they are. They're really impressive.
The second one is notable as well because, forgive me, I'm not bad with my Japanese, but it's written and directed by Kenichi Iwao. I've butchered that.
Yes. Yeah.
But he wrote the original Resident Evil, and that it's generally believed that some of the concepts and things that he used for Parasite Eve 2 were potentially like an early Resident Evil sequel idea. And I know that is a discourse that has existed before.
I don't know if he's ever gone on the record to say it, but it's believable.
No,
considering some of the stuff in that sequel, it's very easily believable too.
But
again,
Parasite Eve 2 was also made by quite a few previous RE team
people
members.
who went to Square. I remember that too. And it feels like it. It's definitely, as I said, it feels like it. And again, much like Dino Crisis 2, if you're looking for something that's Resident Evil-esque of that era and you want to play it and you've never played it, 2 would be a good game. It doesn't even require you've played the first game. It's a pretty standalone narrative. It has its connections to the events of the first, so obviously it's a bit like Resident Evil 2 in that respect. It's like you'll get a little bit out of it if you've played the first and there's connected events. And unlike 1 and 2, you are playing as the same character, but it's a very much mostly standalone narrative.
But what about a direct rip-off then? Talk to me about, because I've never played this, Deep Fear.
Oh, Deep Fear.
I've never played it, and I obviously subscribe, from the Saturn era. One of my greatest ever gaming regrets was never picking up Deep Fear, because if anyone goes on eBay now, it's into the hundreds.
I never owned it, but I rented it. It is ridiculous. I remember the voice acting is atrocious. If people complained about Resident Evil.
Yeah. It's quite obscenely violent, though, if anyone's ever played it. Some of the FMV violence. There's a particular sequence with fingers that I recall, which is very, very violent and unsettling. It's based in like an underwater base. Think like The Abyss, but nothing like it at all in many ways.
more like a ship under the water. It's got like ship hallways. I remember it very clearly.
It's all pre-rendered. It was an amazing little title that was built from the ground up from the Sega Saturn. It looks pretty decent. It plays pretty well. It's a solid sort of survival horror game. Would have probably thrived on the PlayStation if it was, but it's a Sega game ultimately.
Yeah. One other really interesting element to it, which is that it supported analog movement before any Resident Evil game did. Because it supported the Saturn's 3D analog controller, which came out before the PlayStation one did. So it had tank controls, played exactly like Resident Evil, but you had an analog option, which very much, I remember, changed the gameplay feel quite a bit. And I was like, wow, this will be interesting if they do this with Resident Evil. I have a clear memory of playing it at the time and thinking that.
I'm just looking at some footage now. I mean, even the inventory is exactly the same. And
yeah.
We're pretty much playing as Albert Wesker here, aren't we? He's even got his Blue Stars uniform on.
Yeah, it was solid, and it was very well renowned.
John, the blonde-haired guy, is John.
Price-wise, if you're happy to import the Japanese version, you're only paying about 40 quid, 32 to 40 quid. If you want the PAL version,
the PAL version will be the expensive one.
We are talking the cheapest looks to be £340.
Yeah. Crazy.
Plus postage.
I don't even think it got a US release, did it?
No, it didn't. I think, if I remember correctly, there are 2 versions in Europe too, because the UK version had extra censorship applied to it that the other European PAL versions didn't, because of some of the violent stuff. Because there was a reason for it. I need to look this up and see if I'm right, but I'm pretty sure I remember this.
There's other versions, £560, £489.
Yeah, crazy.
This is expensive.
Is this game related to Cold Fear?
Yes and no, in the sense that I think they decided to take the title and concept for it for that later, but it's not at all connected otherwise.
Because Cold Fear is another. Well, it's got the same sort of perspective as Resident Evil 4, hasn't it? And they were released very, very
around
close
the same
together.
time.
Yeah,
much like Deep Fear was I think Deep Fear came out in '98, so it was around that kind of Resident Evil 2 era time. But yeah. If you're looking for an unashamed, Resident Evil ripoff, Deep Fear is probably the closest thing you'd get to.
I'm looking at some of the images. They're definitely in the lab from RE1. It's nearly identical, isn't it? Makes me want to check it out, but I can't.
You can probably watch YouTube videos.
I can watch some YouTube videos.
Sure. I can quickly go through some other stuff, and if anyone wants to talk about them, they can. I'll just quickly go over some of these. So there was Callisto put out 2 Nightmare Creatures games in 97 and 2000. Now they're more based on like a medieval kind of fantasy, and they were kind of 3D. But I think the appetite in 97 was really that they had started to develop something, and then Resident Evil would come out, and they went, "Oh, the horror gaming element has definitely taken off," and they were very focused on the horror thing. There was a game in 97 called The Note, which I've never heard of until literally now. When I looked it up, it was also a first-person horror game. Came out in 1997. I can't seem to find anything about its development, so I don't know anything more about it. From Software, who are now much more famous for other things, came out with a game called Echo Night, which was also a horror title. I've never played that either, but there was some discussions about it being kind of inspired by a bunch of other horror titles, including Resident Evil, Overblood, and many others. And Hell Knight, which again I didn't know anything about, also known as Dark Messiah, that Atlas released in 1998, and I don't know anything about that either. In 99, Countdown Vampires came out, which was a Bandai game, which I did actually play back in the day. It's very much in that Resident Evil clone kind of era of gameplay that obviously decided that they could do a vampire-y kind of like Resident Evil kind of type game. It was alright if I remember correctly. It's like it has some creatures that are very much like the Hunters, I remember it, and there's like these werewolf and mantis things. So basically it's like if you did Resident Evil without the zombies and took all the other monsters from Sweet Home, if you really wanted to take it that way. It's another one of those ones that I would say is not quite as shameless as Deep Fear was, but definitely in the like Resident Evil inspired titles.
I'll jump in with one that I had back in 1999 for the PS1. It was Hard Edge. If you've ever heard of Hard Edge, it was called Trag, I think, in other countries, and it's not a horror game as such, but it's definitely Resident Evil inspired in that it's heavily similar gameplay, pre-rendered backgrounds. It's about like a tactical team it's like Die Hard. They have to go into a high-rise building and liberate some hostages and defeat some terrorists and stuff like that. But the gameplay was very much of the Resident Evil formula as such. Hard Edge.
Just to add to that, a game with a similar concept called Chase the Express, which was basically Die Hard on a train.
Yep, I know Chase the Express.
Obviously not horror, but similar gameplay style to Resident Evil. I very much enjoyed that one.
Yeah, I remember that, Jeepers. Which, ironically, I think they did. I was going to say is like Die Hard meets the Under Siege. The Under Siege is on a train. The second one. Yeah,
you were on I think you were on like a NATO train traveling through Europe, and all the loading screens told you like which countries you were going through, and it was quite a deep plot from what I remember.
Some others from 99, called Dika, which was a Nautilus game from 99. That it was a role-playing game, but again, it played like in this very like 3D character model on rendered backgrounds. It went on to be the inspiration for the very successful Shadow Hearts series. So it's technically known as the prequel to that series, although it's completely unrelated. So people who ever played that will kind of get the idea of what it was. It's quite famous. Blue Stinger, which was a Dreamcast game that actually started as a Saturn game as well. It is also very much in the Resident Evil mold. I think it's quite famous. I think it was an early release for the Dreamcast.
I think it might have even been a launch title.
I'm pretty sure it was a launch title, at least in some areas, maybe not in others. It's an action adventure game, but it definitely has that sort of like third person fixed camera behind the player kind of thing. One of the things that was very interesting of its time is it had a first person view, which, this is again, as I think I said earlier on, there's this idea that sometimes some of these games would come up with an idea or try and implement an idea that perhaps wasn't quite there yet. And eventually other games, including Resident Evil, would go down that path. So, yeah, it was kind of an interesting thing. And, of course, it was a few years before, say, the closest we got to then was Gun Survivor 4, basically, at that point.
One of the biggest titles that I'd only just remembered as we were doing this podcast, and it's massively inspired, and I can't believe it hasn't come up during our prep, is Nocturne by Terminal Reality.
Oh gosh, how did I forget that?
Which also then went on to do the Blair Witch Trilogy, which are all pre-rendered survival horror games, and they're all pretty good. They're all not bad. I mean, Nocturne is hugely inspired by Resident Evil. very similar sort of action gameplay, very similar visual style.
This is the crazy thing, because while I was working on this with Nick, it's like trying to come up with a list of everything, and I came up with a lot, but I'm like, this is not even everything. It's not exhaustive. It's not, it's not expected to be an exhaustive list, because every time I talk to someone's got something I can't remember I've played, or like games you never knew about, or something. But I played those Blair Witch titles, so I know exactly what.
Right, I love them. I was a big Blair Witch fan back in the day. I've never played Nocturne, which is interesting. Just to briefly summarise, I'll not go down a tangent, but Nocturne was a survival horror game that came out in 1999. Terminal Reality made it, and then the Gathering developers, of which Terminal Reality were part of, were tasked to do games that were tied into the Blair Witch universe. So they made a trilogy of games, and Terminal Reality, I believe, did the first one called Rust in Par. And to create that game, they basically made it a pseudo-sequel to Nocturne. So, like, I think two of the characters that were the main characters in Nocturne become the first protagonists of the Blair Witch trilogy games. So it's kind of like this really weird, loose sequel to another game that's not Blair Witch related, but they're all really cool survival horror pre-rendered background games. I remember being fucking terrified of the first Blair Witch game. Really scary.
It was. I remember that very greatly. My friend he loved the movie, and then was like wanting to bring down, play anything that was related or read anything that was related.
Same. I was the same. Yeah, totally.
That introduced me to it. Another one that came out in 1999 was Galerians, which is very much in the vein of Resident Evil, but instead of gunplay, the character had psychic powers, which is kind of really crazy, but you could only really fight one enemy at a time because of it. And it used the same pre-rendered backgrounds. There was a sequel as well that came out on the PS2. I remember playing this briefly and just not really enjoying it and never finishing. I rented it out and played it, and I was a little bit like, oh, okay, this is not what I was hoping it would be. So I don't think I got very far in it at all. There were two horror movie franchise games that were very much inspired by Resident Evil, at least in somewhat in development, that came out in 2000 as well. One was Evil Dead Hail to the King, which is very much a Resident Evil clone. It is pre-rendered backgrounds with enemies that you can't see off camera, and it's basically Evil Dead meets Resident Evil. Like, there's not any other way of putting it. And then there was Alien Resurrection, which everyone who has played it will know is a first-person shooter on the PS1, which is technically impressive for its age. Very good game, very hard. And people will be like, oh, what does that have to do with Resident Evil? Well, the original version of that game was a third-person title. It wasn't actually supposed to be first-person. You can find development images and I think some video online of the first version. I think it pretty much got near completed. And it is a third-person adventure title, very much in the vein of a Resident Evil type. And then they decided crazily that the development needed to restart with the idea of moving it to a first-person title, and they pretty much, I don't think they started completely from scratch, but basically overhauled it for its benefit. But of course, then it delayed it. It didn't come out until... What year did Alien Resurrection come out? 97? So like 3 and a bit years after the movie came out. For a movie tie-in game, a bit of a mess. And we've talked about Alone in the Dark and New Nightmare, but that was the next thing that came out in 2001, which was, as John alluded to, a great game, and very much highly recommend people to try it if they're looking for an old school kind of Resident Evil style fix these days. And as I said, you can now get access to it on the PlayStation Store. Funnily enough, you can buy it, or if you've got Deluxe, it's available as one of the classics. And much like him, highly recommend it.
Then you've got Fatal Frame, which is a bit of a franchise in itself, or Project Zero, as it's known in other parts of the world. I actually own Project Zero 2, the Wii edition, and I have not opened it. It's still mint in sealed box with Nintendo tag. I'm told it's worth a bit of money, so I have not opened it yet, so I can't give you any insight into the Wii edition. But there you go.
The original of Project Zero 2, Fatal Frame 2, is one of the generally regarded as one of the scariest games ever made, Nick. So
is it?
You can imagine the Wii version will make you pee your pants or something.
I mean, I've got Silent Hill Shattered Memories on the Wii, which I think is one of the best gaming experiences I've ever had, first time round.
I hope you still have that too, Nick. You haven't got rid of that.
I have kept that because I don't think playing it for a second time is particularly good. But when you play it for the first time and have absolutely no idea what's going to happen, I think it was legitimately my second favourite Silent Hill game after the first one. And I know people go, what the hell are you talking about? I thought it was fantastic. The use of the Wiimote was ingenious. Anyway, I'm going off on tangent. But yes, because of that, I'm not anti-Wii when it comes to horror games. But as I said, I've yet to breach the seal on Project Zero 2. Perhaps I should one day.
I really struggled. I played the first one and I really struggled with it. I liked it, but I found it really tough, and I don't think I ever finished it. It's frightening. That was it. It was tough and it was frightening. I think it's like what Sean was talking about a bit with the Silent Hill thing. There's a good use of sound in it. There's a good use of environment. And I think I haven't played any of the others of the trilogy, but I suspect that they're all, from what I remember of the reviews and how well that was received as a series, I think they're all pretty much on par. I'm sure there's some Fatal Frame fanatics out there, for lack of a better alliteration, but that will probably be screaming at me right now saying, "Oh my god, I can't believe you haven't played them. They're amazing and you should." But yeah, maybe one day.
Probably last one from me is Extermination on the PS2, which is basically Resident Evil meets Aliens meets Metal Gear Solid meets The Thing. That was a really awesome game back in the day. It was like a biohazard that occurred in an Antarctic research station.
Yeah.
And you led like a team of Marines there. Played as a chap called Dennis, I think.
Dennis?
Yeah.
Dennis.
And the Barry character was a chap called Roger, but they killed him off after like 15 minutes. You sort of thought he was going to be the Barry character assisting you, but then they kill him off.
It was an odd period of time there where there was a bunch of games that all came out in a very short, small space of time that had that kind of feel of like Resident Evil meets something else, meets something else, meets something else, and including the fact that they did a Thing video game.
Yes.
Yeah.
It literally was like a Resident Evil-esque kind of experience, which is being remastered this year, I saw. Which is crazy. It was good. There was the Aliens meets Resident Evil thing with Lance Hendrickson as the voice of Run Like Hell, it has an all-star cast. It's insane. If you actually go look up, I had completely forgotten. I played this on the PS2 and the cast was insane, and I had to go back and double check that what I remember. I'm just going to go look again. Extermination is great, though. I'm going to go back to Extermination. I still have my copy of that game. It is still.
Remember it making the bargain bins? I remember seeing it for £5 everywhere.
It was one of those games where heaps of copies got sold, and then it would either be in the bargain bin. I remember I would go to like the second-hand store, and there was always like 6 copies of it. It sold like heaps, and then everyone just got rid of it. So yeah, Run Like Hell came out in 2002. Has Lance Hendrickson, Kevin Michael Richardson, Thomas F. Wilson, Clancy Brown, Kate Mulgrew, Michael Ironside, Chris Summer, and Brad Dourif as voice actors.
Wow.
It is insane.
That is an insane level
That
of
is
video
insane.
game talent.
The game plays very much like a Resident Evil game in the third person, but in 3D, obviously, at that point. And it's about a person returning to a space station, finding it is overrun by this weird alien species, which is a bit like they're like a combination of like the aliens from Alien with like bug-like elements, like Starship Troopers, but also like standing tall kind of. It's hard to explain, but very Resident Evil inspired, and it had a big marketing campaign, and I think it flopped very, very horribly. I remember the trailers for it at the time, though. The other one that came out was Illbleed, which was the same team that had worked on Blue Stinger decided to make another horror game. Another game, but unlike Blue Stinger, which was more of an action sci-fi, they decided to go full down with the horror element. And then again, much like in this era of games, it's kind of that mashup of it's like Resident Evil, but with these elements instead. And at that point, it meant like putting a bunch of other ideas or being inspirations from like The Thing or like a Carpenter film or Lovecraftian kind of types and all that sort of stuff. So there was all those, and there was just this period where obviously people had gone reactionary to Resident Evil, but they were trying to do something different. And ironically, a lot of people decided to go down the same path of like, let's do kind of weird mutant monsters and space aliens and Antarctic research stations and all space stations and stuff, and do it all very different. But they all ended up being very similar, which is ironic. Capcom had 2 franchises also that obviously came out around the time, and I don't think we need to spend too much time on talking them because I think anyone who listens would know this. But Devil May Cry 1 through 3 came out between 1 and 2005. Obviously started off as Resident Evil 4 and then was redeveloped into what it was. If you look at the artworks and behind the scenes of the first game, it's quite interesting. If you have the HD collection of Devil May Cry, there's a bunch of artworks on there in a gallery, and there's a bunch of like pre-Devil May Cry Resident Evil 4 stuff in there, which is quite worth looking at. Very much a different gameplay, very much action-oriented. The other one was the Onimusha series, which started in 01 as well. There was multiple sequels, 3 mainline ones, and then like a couple of spin-offs, a warrior like tactics game, and a fighting game, and another 4th story game. That goes way back to the PlayStation. The original game was actually developed on, again, I think the 1.5 engine, much like Dino Crisis started on, and the idea was that they were going to do like a Resident Evil with ninjas or samurai. And it was talked about back in early 1997, so very early on. And that became Onimusha, which again, the first two especially have the pre-rendered backgrounds and the tank-ish controls of Resident Evil, and feel like a different gameplay take, but definitely have the origins and DNA of that. The third one, a little bit different, goes away from the pre-renders into like 3D environments, but quite detailed 3D environments. They're kind of similar to the Outbreak titles in that regard, like the style and design looks more like the Resident Evil Outbreak games.
So we then had Clock Tower 3.
Capcom took over the Clock Tower. Well, they didn't fully took over the rights ownership, but they licensed them out, and I think they have partial ownership. So it's an interesting title. I'll let Sean talk about it more, because I think he's had more understanding or experience of it than I ever did.
The funny thing is, I've still never actually played it. I've only ever studied it quite deeply online, but it is directed by Kenji Fukasaku, who is the director of the first Battle Royale movie and a wealth of like Yakuza movies from the 70s and the 80s and things like that. A very, very well renowned director from Japan. So to get him to come and do the cutscenes for Clock Tower 3, the FMVs, was massive. Clock Tower 3 is an experience. It was the beginning of a Capcom that was starting to explore really fucked up adult sensibilities in terms of their horror genre. Because, like, you talk about, like, Resident Evil being like an adult franchise, but at the end of the day, it's heroes blasting zombies with, firepower and things like that. I don't want to say it's juvenile, but it leans itself into an audience that is, like, they're scary games at times. And certainly as they've gone on into their later years, they've leaned into different genres and things like that. Resident Evil 7 is obviously its very own thing, but those early games are just, they're very much like a Romero movie as a video game. We've not really talked about Romero very much, but, they exist within a certain capacity, and you don't expect too much from them with regards to, as long as they're just giving you like blood and guts, that's fine. But like Clock Tower 3, and we'll talk about this as we go into Haunting Ground, Capcom was moving into a more traumatizing kind of horror. It's the kind of horror that gets under your skin and it stays with you. And anyone who's watched certain sequences from Clock Tower 3, despite the fact that the voice acting is absolutely awful, the visuals that are burned into your brain will never leave you. When you have seen a kind, dear old lady who just like knits clothing, gets sprayed in the face by acid, thrown into a 200-litre drum or whatever it is, and then poured acid on, and she just fucking dissolves away whilst this maniacal person's laughing. Or when you watch like a 10-year-old girl, I think it is, gets smashed over the head with a mallet and dies. Like, this is a different Capcom. This isn't a Capcom making a zombie survival horror game. They're like exploring different types of messed up violence, which will sort of reach a crescendo in Haunting Ground. Clock Tower 3 it's technically survival horror, but it's more of a sort of interesting interactive puzzle game where you're chased by a pursuer, but you've got to do like a series of tasks and events more than you do in combat. So it's not similar to Resident Evil as such, but it is camera angle driven. Anyone who's played a Resident Evil game will be right at home in terms of what that game provides. But in terms of like how much it pushes the envelope in what was culturally accepted at the time, Clock Tower 3 is messed up. Even, nearly 20 years on, you look back to some of those cutscenes and you will sit here, even if you're hardened with the the horror genre and things like that, if you think you've seen everything, there's moments in that which will make you go, that was a bit much for 2003, wasn't it?
The reason why this is a really good point is that I feel like the post-Silent Hill era was a changing of the guard, and there was a mixture, and I feel like even Capcom was responsive to this when you look at something like Clock Tower 3. As I was talking about before, there was a bunch of like playoff games where through kind of 2001, 2002, there was this era of making these kind of like creature-driven games that were like Resident Evil-esque in their gameplay element, but very much different in the style of what they wanted for their enemy types or the type of gameplay sometimes around them. I think the counter to that was after Silent Hill, and especially Silent Hill 2, you started to see more and more like psychological games or games with more thought put into the horror elements.
Yeah, that's a great phrase, actually, yeah.
And Clock Tower 3 was definitely a response to that. The year before, Silicon Knights put out Eternal Darkness, which I wouldn't put on a list of like Resident Evil-esque games per se, but I have mentioned it on my list because it was that antithesis, and they specifically, Dennis Dyack came out and specifically said, I want something more grounded and psychological that isn't campy B-horror like Resident Evil. He called out Resident Evil for being the antithesis of what he was thinking about with this game. So you start seeing this kind of psychological element coming through more and more. You had Eternal Darkness and Clock Tower 3, the Forbidden Siren title, which again had one of the creative directors who worked on Silent Hill on it. Kuon from First Software was again different horror, and then Capcom again with Haunting Ground. There wasn't that kind of move away from the traditional Resident Evil type horror game was really starting to come through. And unfortunately, that also coalesced with the idea of the slight demise in Resident Evil. We were waiting for Resident Evil 4, the remake, and Resident Evil 0 on GameCube didn't do as well as Capcom expected. The Outbreak games were a limited audience for online. The last real big selling title for them had been Code Veronica X, really, when you look at the scale of things. So there was a change in the types of appetite for horror gaming and horror elements, and it really starts to come through in the type of games and the number of them that are coming out.
Where would you class Rule of Rose in this, Rob? Because that's obviously one of the most sought after psychological survival horrors now.
It's in that era. I mean, this is it. It was like these people making a decision to make something that wasn't campy B horror. And this is where I was going back to my comment about Silent Hill really having an impact, whether or not it may not have sold the levels that Resident Evil had. And Resident Evil still has and had its place, but there was a certain strike of genius in that Silent Hill psychological element that people went, you know what, there's something there. There's something more in the unknown, and there's more in the understanding of events, and there's more in the fear element that is constantly driving, rather than the jump scares or the occasional scariness of what a Resident Evil game had been. And I really think that started to appeal to a certain audience, I guess, who had grown up on Resident Evil. And I don't want to say that we're all tired of the shtick, because we weren't, but you wanted something maybe a little bit more broaching at times. You didn't want to always play Resident Evil all the time, and so having other games that were just like Resident Evil wasn't going to be the be all and end all. And I think that's what games like that are. The response to something like Rule of Rose or Clock Tower 3 or Eternal Darkness are all very much in that element. I mean, that's just my take. What do you think, Sean?
No, I'd agree with everything you said, Rob. I think it was a very experimental time for the horror genre, and it was, sort of ironically coinciding with a Capcom that didn't really know what Resident Evil was. It kind of got lost in this landscape of experimental horrors and things like that, and it took the great Shinji again, rewriting the rule book, essentially, and choosing not to mimic or ape what was being done at the time. I think if Resident Evil had tried to do... I mean, the funny thing is, if you go back to like the early version of Resident Evil 4 that was originally debuted, the Cradle of the Progenitor virus and all that, the version of Resident Evil 4 that was pitched was a psychological horror, with Leon, with all the hallucinations and the creepy dolls and things like that.
Yeah.
It takes a brave visionary to go against the tide of what the horror genre was doing at the time and go, nah, I can see this. If I do this, I'm just going to be compared to all my peers. We need to do something different to keep this franchise alive. It takes a visionary to do that. I can see why, when Alex has come onto the podcast before and he's spoken nothing but praise for Mikami for doing what he's done to this franchise. It's funny how I've dawned on this as we've talked about it now, and your pitch to me just there, Rob. Like, so many game directors and developers would have fallen into that trap of looking at what Clock Tower 3 was doing and everything else and all that, and just going,
I mean, they had Haunting Ground. They had Haunting Ground going on, and there's an overlap between Resident Evil 4 and Haunting Ground.
Yeah.
And so they could have easily gone down that path, 100%.
But it took Mikami to say, no, we need to do something else here, because otherwise we're just going to be compared to all that. And Resident Evil is going to be a chaser instead of a trailblazer.
100% agree with you, and I think you should be right to praise Mikami, because there's been a lot of visionist history, I think, about he didn't do a lot, and it's like, nah, the writers were the heroes of Resident Evil, and it's like, you can't diminish his role for the precise reasons. And let's just have a look at some of the games we've spoken about that have been influenced by Resident Evil. How many are still going? And the answer is Silent Hill, just Alone in the Dark, probably just gone again. We haven't spoken about Dead Space, but that's more of a slightly later on. But
Clock Tower's getting a revival, but that predates Resident Evil, so it's like
this is the thing. Resident Evil 4 may not be everyone's cup of tea who've grown up on the OG trilogy, but without it, there is no doubt that we wouldn't be here. So
it's interesting too. It shared this idea as well that, ironically, the same movement of psychological horror. We had this rise of zombie media away from Resident Evil. Resident Evil is starting to reduce itself. We get to 4 and we've gone, no zombies. We've got the zombie replacements. And yet we've got this rise of the Romero zombie, media co-current to the psychological horror in gaming. It's like this element of time that Resident Evil inspired over several years did have a knock-on effect in media. I don't know if everyone can quantify that. There's no direct correlation, but there are a few. I would say you look at something like the Resident Evil movie, which, it's not faithful 100%, but hey, it's a zombie movie. It still has zombies in it, and it came out in 2002. Shaun of the Dead, when it came out in 2004, is inspired by a scene from Spaced, which has Resident Evil 2 in it. These elements of things that did trickle through, I think, did help push this culture of zombie media, which ironically then the gaming industry had started to kind of shy away from that, what Resident Evil had inspired and going down its own path, while Resident Evil then, as Sean has correctly said, blazed a new path forward, completely against type, both for gaming and for the media landscape. It would have been very easy, I think, by 2005, especially after, if Resident Evil 4 had just been another zombie game, it could have been very easy for Capcom to rest on its laurels about the idea that, well, zombies are popular right now, so, let's double down on those zombies as well. Like, the fact that Mikami took a bold move to not only move it away from psychological horror, but also to completely change the gameplay loop, the type of enemies, and still call it Resident Evil, that's a massive gamble, and it's amazing that it paid off, but, the game was so solid, that's what helped,
Well, I think we're heading towards the end of our discussion at where we wanted to pitch this podcast in terms of the timescales. I mean, I think it may be worth having a final concluding thought about, as I said, the Romero zombies you mentioned there, Rob, about the revival of zombie movies, but the influences that the Romero films, the original films, have had on Resident Evil is obviously enormous as well. They've often spoken about that really there's not many zombie films prior to Resident Evil. As you've already kind of alluded to. So, Romero's influence, and I think not necessarily just even having the zombie, but having the kind of social narrative behind it, which, of course, is a hallmark of the Romero films, but by not just having a random zombie blasting game, or even just a random haunted house, this is what we drew into the conspiracy element that here we've got this big organisation, pharmaceutical company that everyone knows, oh, by the way, also funds stars, they're all part of it, and you've got your leader is
corruption. Exactly. That narrative is the same thing that John, talked about earlier. Those things about the notes and the background and the stuff was something that you just didn't have a lot of, and I think it was again one of those things I think we haven't really touched on as we've talked about all these other games. But a lot of these other games went down that thing. You'd start picking up files and information about characters' backgrounds, and it really set off that trend of like, hey, we're going to add some more backstory to this by having more information that you pick up, or you pick up audio files or text files or whatever it is. But one of those elements that the original really pulled down on. And I think it comes from that. It comes from part of that haunted house element. You want to know the mystery behind the haunted house, but it also comes from that ability to tell a narrative that's, cinematic in scope and it's wider than the game you're experiencing. And then it also comes down to, that humanizing element or that social commentary that something like a Romero zombie film would have had. It puts people that are somewhat relatable into an experience that you wouldn't want to go through, but when you get to do it in the realms of a video game, you get to experience something that on a personal level, I would never want to live through. But I get the fun element of that, being able to live vicariously through it and experience a different dynamic of anything. And horror, the reason why people love horror and why people will watch horror movies, even though they'll say, oh, it's really scary or I hate it, it gets their heart racing, it gets them involved, it gets them engaged, and it gets them in a way that, they wouldn't have otherwise, been. It's something that it takes you out of your comfort zone, but in a fun, safe way. In an enjoyable way. And when you can grab those elements that allow you to engage more with it, they stick with you. And I think that's the whole thing about this franchise. The reason why it's stuck with everyone is all those little elements came together for a real original, or the pieces, if you took them individually, not original, but you put them together and it became this refreshing original element of a game that we had never seen before and inspired so many others.
Well, as you say, you can pick up the obvious elements of a Romero movie there with zombies. Subtle elements are also there, but even something like Jurassic Park, the kind of godlike eugenics of Umbrella. As a kid, you would have watched Jurassic Park, oh, brilliant, dinosaurs, that kind of thing. But then actually, if you watch it, you kind of realise Hammond's kind of the villain, in this kind of delusional belief that he could do that. And then you kind of, like, years later, you'll play Resident Evil and kind of go, what are they, it is that right to be God. and that playing with, humans and experimentation, and that kind of feeds in. And as I said earlier, I think we've been quite privileged just in the way these things kind of came out with things like Jurassic Park in '93, and then other elements. And I'm not saying it's perfect, and some kids' films touching on eugenics and things like that. It really kind of helped build up this idea of almost like this kind of left-wing-esque. Whoa, I don't trust these big companies.
Yeah, but I think it's that thing of technology and change at the time, right? Like, there's always a distrust in science. It's a constant, right? Like, what would you talk about now if you're talking about distrust in science? You're talking about AI. So it's that same thing of a different era. I think we always have a distrust in the things we don't know, the things that we fear. And so these things, horror in particular, preys on that idea constantly. It can be science technology fear, which it would be for biological weapons or genetics, but it can be anything. And so inherently, when you find that human link, that condition to it, I think the thing I lament, and I really want to get Sean and John on this because they're very much heavy on the plot, is one of the things I feel like we do lose a lot in the later years of Resident Evil, and this is no detriment, it's just where things have gone, is the longer the franchise has gone on, I feel like I've been less connected to those individuals, less connected to those events, because they've become far more fantastical in order for the plot to move forward, which makes it harder. So when you get someone like Ethan coming in Resident Evil 7, who's seemingly a much more normal, I say normal character, but like a regular guy, that's the impetus to bring back that horror element of someone who's like a fish out of water, for lack of a better term. And I think it is something that the franchise has slowly lost its identity of. And I'd be very interested to see what the guys think about that and if they agree, because that's something that's struck in my mind from time and time when you play, especially Resident Evil 6, for example, but even Village in some respects. You start doing these superhuman events. It's like you stop being relatably scared because the person has powers, they have abilities, so there's no reason for them to be scared.
I can truly say that, even taking aside the VR experience away, the most frightened I've been of any modern RE game is going down the basement in RE7. And that comes from not being superpowered with an arsenal behind you or a BSAA team supporting you. That goes back to the very basics of exactly what I said at the beginning of the podcast, of being in an isolated house, no idea what's waiting for you, and just being a pawn in a much bigger dollhouse, if you like. So yeah, I can completely agree. I think stripping it back to the basics is what works.
Yeah, I think Sean made the point perfectly well. All our heroes now, as much as we love them, they've got too much plot armor. Death Island, for example, there was no tension there because we knew everyone was going to be fine at the end of it. And likewise, with any Resident Evil 9 that comes along, if it plays Chris, Jill, Leon, whoever, there's no tension there because they've done it all, before. They're not going to die. Capcom's not going to kill them off. So what they did with Ethan in Resident Evil 7, Sean's absolutely right. It's just an everyday man with no training, no experience with BOWs, and that's what makes the fear, much more real. Resident Evil is a victim of its own success. It's been going on for so long now. What do you do to make it fresh? How do you make it scary in this day and age when, we've seen pretty much every type of monster? So, yeah, it's a problem moving forward, but strip it back, go back to basics, because as much as we love Chris and Jill, they're just too invincible. They've become superheroes, and the whole point of horror is it needs to be real, it needs to be tangible, and you can't relate to a Superman in a horror film.
Well, I think we've kind of covered everything we intended, and that kind of ends on an interesting segue into where the kind of series ends, at kind of like Resident Evil 4, I suppose.
I think this very much feels like a part one of this discussion, because somewhat amazingly, like Capcom,
we do it again.
Capcom do this again when they remake Resident Evil 2, and you find that not only is Resident Evil 2 inspired by certain things going into that game, but they have started with RE2 Remake a brand new renaissance of the survival horror genre that is influencing absolutely every single new horror game that comes out now, whether it's your Dead Space remake, whether it's your Alone in the Dark remake. That game,
Silent Hill 2.
That game is just, it is so important, Resident Evil 2 remake. So that'll be a great discussion for next time.
Indeed. But we hope everyone has enjoyed this. It's not really something we normally do, but something that the team felt that we could do is just as a slightly experimental podcast. And I hope there's a few games that we've mentioned that perhaps you might want to try out that you haven't tried in the past. Certainly, there's a few I didn't know about before. That does conclude our main discussion. We do have time, thankfully, ladies and gentlemen, for this podcast edition of Neptune's Biohazard Quiz.
Do you know your G virus from your C virus? And your Jabberwock from your Bandersnatch? Or perhaps the number of bombs that appear on the Made in Heaven vest?
What kind of fucking question is that?
I'm getting a big fat zero this week.
Yeah, I'm not going to get any of these.
We've talked about the games straying too far from the origins. This Resident Evil quiz. We're now getting Spice Girls as the correct answer. I mean, it's time to quit.
This is Neptune's Biohazard Quiz. Batman. Star Tyrants. George Trevor. Robbie McGregor. Mr. Spencer. Neptune's Biohazard Quiz.
So, welcome one and all. We have 5 interesting questions. Question number 1, a welcome return of the timeline question. On the 1st of August 1998, who decides to run for city councilman? Question number 2, which outbreak took place in northern Kudhankan? Yes, that's what I'm going with. So, which outbreak took place in northern Kudhankan? Question number 3, a welcome return of the Where Am I?
Yeah.
Round, yeah.
Yes.
Yes, it's not quite as exciting as the last one, but not too bad. So, where am I? Right. I am in the OG RPD main hall, where I climb a nearby ladder. Once at the top, I turn left. Following the path, I enter the only room available. In this room, I spot some more stairs and ascend. However, an in-game event suddenly occurs. Dramatic music. I exit the door that I did not come in from, and then in the new area take the first door on the right. Where am I? Question number 4. Combining the silver gear with the gold gear in Resident Evil 3 makes what? And finally, question number 5. A welcome return of the odd one out round. Now, of course, remember the rules are...
no. Car manufacturers, guys.
No. I've been very reserved. So there's probably a few odd ones out, but I'm thinking a very specific one. That will get you the point, but we'll see how we get on. So who is the odd one out when it comes to these? Number 1, Ada Wong. Number 2, Hunk. Number 3, Glenn Arias. Or 4, the old hag from Resident Evil Village. So your 4 options there. Ada Wong, Hunk, Glenn Arias, or the old hag from Resident Evil Village. Which one of those is the odd one out? So there are the 5 questions. Welcome back, one and all. Let's see how well everyone has done. So question number 1 was a timeline question. On 1st of August 1998, who decides to run for city councilman? We'll start with Romby.
I have absolutely no idea.
Oh no! Stars Tyrant, any better?
I had no idea. Irons. I guess Irons.
Irons, Brian Irons. Batman?
Joel Clemens.
Unsurprisingly, that is correct. It is Joel Clemens. Question number 2. Which outbreak took place in northern Kudhankan? Batman, did you know this one?
Mahawa Academy. Mahawa Desire.
Stars Tyrant?
I had no idea, so I guessed Javier.
Have you? Oh, okay. Yes. Romby?
I had no idea, and I was like, I'm not even sure if you're speaking anything intelligible, so...
Points to Batman. It is the Mahara Academy. You're thinking of Mixcoatl in the Mixcoatl village in Ampara.
Okay, thank you, Nick. Oh,
That's okay.
Did you pull that from memory, or have you
I
got-
did. I pulled that from my Monopoly board.
Then you should be doing these fucking quizzes. Then, shouldn't you?
So good start from Batman here. So question number 3 was the where am I? So I was in the RPD main hall where I climbed the ladder, turned left. Following the path, I went through the only room available, went up some stairs, in-game event. I exit through the door, went into a new area, first door on the right. Where am I? Batman.
The corridor outside the STARS office. When you say exit through a door you didn't come into a new area,
Yes.
and then take the door.
And then
on
go,
the right.
yes, then I go into I take the first door on the right. So what room am I then in
First door on the right.
that you come across on the right?
I want to say it's the corridor that leads back to the STARS office, where the Coke machine is. There's a door there, because the other corridor has the broken door that Sherry crawls under. So I'm going to say the back end of the corridor that leads to the STARS office, but from the opposite direction you'd normally go there, if that makes sense.
Stars Tyrant, what did you have?
This can only be the corridor outside the STARS office, because you've put us into the corridor where, as John says, the Coke machine is. But if it's the first door on the right, you've got to basically go all the way fucking round the wall, across the lockers, all the way back up. It's technically more on the left. But you're a tricky fucker, you are, Nicholas. So this can only be the corridor outside the STARS office. It's the only way. I've drawn the fucker as I've been doing the quiz. I've got it in front of me in a crudely drawn sketch. Because that door that you're talking about, Nicholas, if it's the first door on the right, is boarded up, and only Sherry goes under it when she crawls.
Okay.
So if that's the case, you bastard, then it's a different corridor. But if you're talking about a working door within the game, it's the corridor outside the STARS office.
Romby, what did you put?
Well, I put the same thing because that was the only place I could get to. But I'm now thinking, you see there was an in-game event and it didn't say specifically what that in-game event was. Now, have we gotten across? Have we gotten across exactly? Has he not? If that's the case, then you're in the clock tower because he went out onto the upper balcony and turned right into the first door on the right, which would be the clock tower area. So I'm going with the clock tower.
The point goes to Stars Tyrant. We are in that corridor outside the STARS office.
That door's not to the right.
It is if you follow it all the way around.
Oh,
it's nonsense.
What a twat.
If you were to literally put your hand on the right-hand wall and feel it all the way around, eventually that door would be on the right.
Be on your right-hand side.
Nick, you are evil.
The problem is the RPD is so well known, and I try and make it a little bit more interesting. The last one we did, RE7, we kind of went back on ourselves all the way back to the same spot, so I thought we'll try and make it.
Can I just ask, technically, am I right if the event is that I managed to get across the thing without it falling down? Like,
You don't ever do you. It always falls.
Brilliant. So points to Stars Tyrant there. Well done. Well done, sir.
Whoa. I said that corridor as well.
He did.
Oh, was it you did? Oh, sorry.
It was the one I was going for, but then changed my mind because I was of the unexplained.
If you're talking about that first door on the right, then there is a boarded up one, which is the one that Sherry crawls under, which was hilariously moved in one of the betas. It's actually in a different place.
Yeah, it's on the side of the wall. It doesn't quite work. Is it on the STARS wall side or is it on the opposite side? I can't remember, but it's on one side.
It's in the statue room. It's
a
little mini...
That's right, it's on the back wall as opposed to the right wall.
I actually don't know which is more accurate in terms of alignment. I've never actually checked. But they must have moved it to be more in alignment, so...
Right, question number 4 was combining the silver gear with the gold gear in Resident Evil 3 makes what? Stars Tyrant.
Is it the Kronos gear?
Romby.
I have Kronos gear.
Batman.
Yeah, Kronos gear.
Is, yes. Points all round. Finally, question number 5 was the odd one out round, so normal REP rules apply, which is the odd one out of Ada Wong, Hunk, Glenn Arias, the old hag from Village. Romby, do you want to hazard a guess?
God, this could be anything.
It could.
We're here again, aren't we, ladies and gentlemen? It's not about our knowledge, it's about how to get into Nicholas's head.
I've already gone through this once with the bloody where am I thing. I was like the old hag because she doesn't have any connection directly with anything to do with Umbrella or Neo Umbrella, but I've got nothing else, so I'm going with that.
Go for the old hag.
Yeah.
Stars Tyrant, what are you going for?
I've gone for Arius because he's the only one in a CGI movie and not a video game.
That's factually correct. Is it the right answer?
Sean, you're right, but you're wrong at the same time. That's basically what he just said.
Batman, what is the answer? 'Cause I think you might know it.
To be honest, I don't. I've reached that time of the night when my brain's stopped working. I don't know. I'm going to say Ada, because she's the only one who isn't affiliated in any way with some kind of umbrella. I don't know. I honestly don't know. I can't even guess.
Well, the good news is one of you is correct. It's the old hag from Resident Evil Village.
Unbelievable.
Well done, Rob. Do you know why?
No, I've got it right, but I don't know why. So technically, did I get it right?
This is the worst kind of shooting star question.
Because
Name
she's
a breed of
the
dog.
only one who's not human.
No, Ada Wong, Hunk, Glen Arias, they are not their real names. Whereas RE Village is just someone being impersonated. So whilst Ada Wong is...
She's still pretending to be someone she's not.
She is, but she doesn't...
Which is the whole point of having an alias, is it not?
But there's no change of name. So Ada Wong is not a real name, Hunk is not a real name, Glen Arias is not his real name, Village Hag, we don't know her name, but it's...
Name a breed of dog. German Shepherd. No, it's a Golden Retriever. You're wrong.
That is a
shooting star
terrible
question,
answer,
and you
Nick.
know
It is.
Because the
It's a
old
terrible
hag
answer.
the old hag isn't even a name, so it's just a colloquial term.
Yes.
And the whole point is she's meant to be in disguise, so she's the name she's not going to use is Miranda.
But it's still Miranda. That's the whole point. It's still Miranda, isn't it? Whereas the others are...
As John once famously said, balls to this.
Yeah, balls to this. I'm out.
Omni shambles. Omni shambles.
So let's have a look at the final scores. Congratulations, Batman, you win.
Let's have a look at them, Nick. Yeah, how are you tying this one up?
4, well done. And in joint second, Stars and Rob with 2 points. So congratulations. That does conclude the quiz. Join us next time. Well, we'll have some more questions, probably. There we go. So that does mean we are towards the end of the podcast. Coming up next, well, we keep teasing Resident Evil 9, but you and I are in a same position. We're hoping for an announcement at some point. If Resident Evil 9 is not forthcoming, we may step back into the murky world of Resident Evil Outbreak File 2, as it is 20 years. So we'll be looking at Wild Things and Underbelly. But we're hoping for an RE9 announcement. It would be fantastic if it was, but we'll keep that. Otherwise, it'd probably be Outbreak File 2. We'll start that coverage as we head towards the end of the year. So I'd like to thank everyone for listening. We hope you've enjoyed it. Goodbye from me, Neptune.
Goodbye from me, Batman.
Goodbye from me,
So-
Stars Tyrant.
And goodbye from me, Robbie.
confession time. Sean, I'd like to personally thank you for giving me a very nice out on that Where Am I round, because my answers was the Stars office. I totally forgot about that corridor.
Fucking hell.
You bastard.
Which
I
corridor
was
did you
right
forget?
the whole time. He had gotten the door wrong. Oh, God.
I'm just disappointed.
Sorry.